Hello, fellow sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. Whether you're in bed, eyes half closed, or stirring a pot in a quiet kitchen, or just trying to survive another long night of emails with a tab open in the background, this is your invitation to slow down. This channel is made for curious apes like you, the kind still wondering why the world turned out this way. And if you do drift off, that's fine. I've placed timestamps in the description below, so if you fall asleep somewhere in the middle, you can pick up right where you left off. Because the full story is worth hearing, from start to end. This is not a channel of conspiracy, fantasy, or loud speculation. It's a quiet space for soft science, for humble facts, for deep time, for archaeology, genetics, and history told carefully and slowly by someone who doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but is doing their best to ask the right questions. And if you appreciate that kind of storytelling, that kind of science, I'd be grateful if you'd like and subscribe. It helps others find this kind of content too, the kind that makes you smarter, not just louder. The kind of education that travels far, not by force, but by curiosity. And if you feel like sharing, tell me how you use this. Do you fall asleep to it? Do you play it in the car? Do you walk to it, cook to it, shower with it? Or maybe you're somewhere specific in the world, a corner of time and place I'll never see. Either way, I'd love to know. Tonight's story begins in the wind-carved grasslands of Mongolia, where a man once rose from tribal exile to rule over the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen. But we're not here to glorify him. We're here to ask, did he actually change us? Not culturally, not politically, but genetically. This is the story of the empire that may have changed our genes, and the scientific myth that followed. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Let's begin. Tonight, we begin with a silence. Not a metaphorical one, but a literal archaeological silence that has lasted nearly 800 years. Somewhere beneath the high grasses of Mongolia, or maybe in the shadows of a long-eroded mountain trail, or perhaps even deeper, hidden under centuries of river sediment or forest decay, there lies a body that no one has found, or perhaps no one has dared to reveal. The man in question is Genghis Khan, Temujin, as he was born, somewhere in the mid to late 12th century, and though he would one day become the supreme ruler of the largest land empire the world has ever known, we have never found his bones, and without bones we have no DNA. Without DNA, no test. Without test, no proof. That missing body is where our story begins. According to historical records, those few that survived the fires and fluid loyalties of 13th century Asia, Temujin died in the summer of the year 1227, while returning from a campaign against the Western Xia dynasty, in what is now northwestern China. The cause of death is debated, and has been since almost immediately after it happened. Some accounts say he died of wounds from falling off his horse. Others claim illness, perhaps contracted during the brutal siege campaign. Later sources, far more speculative and usually designed to discredit him, suggest assassination by a captured princess, or even the plague itself, which would later wreak havoc across Eurasia. But the truth is, we do not know. The original secret history of the Mongols, written shortly after his death, is curiously vague. All we're told is that the Khan passed, his empire wept, and then they buried him, quietly. The secrecy was deliberate. Mongol traditions around death were radically different from those of the sedentary empires they would soon conquer. The body of a leader was not displayed, not mummified, not entombed in pyramids or pagodas. It was not even openly mourned in public ritual. Instead, it was hidden, buried in silence without a permanent marker, sometimes high on a mountain, close to the eternal blue sky of Tengri, sometimes in forested ravines, sometimes deep beneath the steppe, trampled over by herds to erase the disturbance in the soil. The fear was not just of grave robbers or desecration, it was spiritual. To the Mongols, the dead retained their power, and that power could be disturbed. Protecting the grave of a Khan meant protecting the empire from unrest, and protecting the empire meant erasing the trail entirely. According to one of the more haunting versions of the story, Genghis Khan's funeral procession was accompanied by a deadly escort. Along the journey, every person the procession encountered, hunter, farmer, traveller, it didn't matter, was killed to keep the direction secret. When they finally reached the burial site, the soldiers who dug the grave were themselves executed. And then those executioners were also killed, perhaps by a final team sworn to silence. It is a story told often, and whether true or not, it reveals something essential. The location of Genghis Khan's final resting place was meant to vanish into the land. His death, like so much of his life, became a strategy, a myth, and for centuries it worked. In the centuries that followed, no record emerged that pinpointed the site, no grave mound, no sacred tomb, no pyramid carved with his name, just stories, passed through generations, growing foggier and more dramatic with each telling. Some claim he lies buried somewhere in the Khenti Mountains, northeast of modern-day Ulaanbaatar, in a sacred region known as Ich-Korig, the Great Taboo. For over 800 years, this forested and mountainous zone was kept off limits to outsiders, and even to most Mongols, guarded first by imperial watchmen and later by national military patrols. It is protected still today, a vast natural reserve where wolves and deer wander freely, and where excavation remains politically and culturally sensitive. Many believe the tomb is there, deep in the folds of that restricted landscape. But belief is not evidence. In the early 2000s, fueled by advances in satellite imaging and a growing hunger for grand discoveries, a number of archaeological projects set out to find him. One of the most ambitious efforts came not from a government or a museum, but from the public itself. In 2012, over 10,000 online volunteers joined forces in a crowdsourced mission to scan satellite images of Mongolia, each person combing through digital landscapes in search of telltale patterns, rectilinear disturbances, unusual soil coloration, shadows that might indicate ancient human activity. The project, hosted on a citizen science platform, generated more than 3 million scans, each one a tiny gesture of hope, and from those digital eyes came 55 promising locations scattered across the Mongolian steppe. A National Geographic expedition followed, investigating those sites on foot, combining satellite data with local oral traditions, historical maps, and non-invasive surveys. They found burial mounds. They found imperial-era artifacts. They found promising signs, but not the Khan. One site in particular, near Tavantolgoy in eastern Mongolia, revealed 5 elite male graves, surrounded by gold and weaponry, and carbon dated to the right era. Some researchers believe they might have stumbled on a royal burial, perhaps even close family members of Genghis himself. But the DNA from those remains did not match the infamous Y chromosome cluster that would later become popularly associated with the Khan. And even if it had, we would still not know what his DNA looked like, because we have never had his bones to compare against. That is the scientific problem. The foundation of every genetic myth surrounding Genghis Khan begins not with a positive ID, but with an assumption. If you do not have a control sample, no teeth, no bone, no tissue, then any link drawn between living people and an ancient figure remains circumstantial. Suggestive, but not confirmable. It is the equivalent of drawing a family tree from shadows. You can guess, but you cannot prove. This is what separates archaeology from storytelling, from politics, from legend. The history of Genghis Khan is already extraordinary. He was born into hardship, rose through merit and charisma, united fractured tribes, and built an empire that changed the world. But what he left behind, the exact molecules, the genetic strands, the biological markers of his body, those remain missing. And until they are found, every claim about his descendants, his haplogroup, his genetic footprint, must be understood for what it is, an educated hypothesis, not a fingerprint, not a face. The question then is why this silence persists. Why has no one, in 800 years, dared or succeeded in opening that grave? Part of the answer lies in reverence. In Mongolian tradition, disturbing the burial site of a great leader is considered a grave violation of spiritual order. Even modern archaeologists working in the region have encountered resistance, not just from the government, but from local communities who feel the ground should be left undisturbed. Part of it too lies in politics. Genghis Khan remains a national symbol. His face adorns currency. His name anchors airports, monuments, museums. And while many Mongolians honour his legacy, They do not necessarily want that legacy reduced to a handful of bones in a lab. The absence may be intentional, a kind of cultural safeguard against overexposure. And then there is the simple fact of scale. Mongolia is vast. The burial could be in a valley that has never been mapped, or under centuries of sediment, or in a cave collapsed and forgotten. No matter how much satellite data we collect, no matter how much we digitize and analyze, there is still the raw unpredictability of Earth. Not everything leaves a trace we can read. Not everything wants to be found. So tonight, as we begin this journey into the myth and science of the Mongol genetic legacy, we do so with an essential humility. The man whose name shaped empires, who redrew maps and rerouted history, has left us no physical trace of his body. That does not make the story less interesting. In fact, it makes the story more honest. We are not here to inflate legends or decode invisible bloodlines. We are here to ask what the science can tell us, and what it cannot. And so, the silence remains. Somewhere out there, perhaps in a grove of larch trees, or deep beneath an unassuming hill, or maybe in a place the maps no longer name, the bones of Genghis Khan may still lie undisturbed. Not because no one cared to find them, but because someone 800 years ago cared so deeply and they made sure we never could, and that raises the question we'll carry forward. If we cannot find the body of a man said to have changed the world, how can we ever know if he changed our genes? What kind of society births an empire this mobile? Before there were armies galloping across continents or generals trading silk for siegecraft, there were families on horseback. And before that, there were just animals and weather and hunger. The Mongolian steppe stretching out across northeastern Central Asia is not a land that grants easy survival. It is an ocean of dry grass, pocked by hills, framed by mountains, scorched in summer, and frozen solid through winter. Rain is unreliable. Rivers can vanish for years. Trees are rare. The wind is constant. And yet for over 1,000 years before the rise of any Khan, people lived here, moved here, fought and sang and buried their dead here, adjusting their lives to the rhythm of animals, sky and ground. They did not build cities. That much we know. Not in the way of their neighbours to the south in China or the west in Transoxiana. They built homes that could be folded and packed. Structures made of felt, wool and collapsible wooden lattices, tied together with rope and muscle memory, carried on carts pulled by oxen or yaks. These were called yurts or yurts in Turkic languages. Round, low-slung dwellings, insulated against the wind, warm in winter, breathable in summer, and always facing south to catch the morning light. To live in one was to understand the season. You didn't invest in a house because the land didn't belong to you. The land belonged to the herds, and the herds had to move. Most of what we know about early Mongolian life before the 12th century comes from a combination of archaeological remains, later ethnographic accounts, and comparative studies with surviving nomadic cultures. The archaeological record is patchy. Structures leave little behind when they are made to disappear by design. What does remain are burial sites, stone markers, bone deposits, and the long arc of material continuity stretching back through the Bronze Age. These people lived with animals, almost symbiotically. Sheep and goats made up the majority of their herds. Yaks and oxen provided transport. Camels carried heavier loads in southern regions, and then there were the horses. To understand the Mongol world before history, you must understand the horse not as a tool, but as a dimension of life. Horses were not luxury animals or battlefield assets. They were basic survival. They were how you travelled, how you herded, how you hunted, how you measured wealth, and how you sang. A family might own dozens, a clan might manage hundreds. Stallions were kept separate. Mares were prized for their milk, fermented into ayrag, a mildly alcoholic drink still central to Mongolian hospitality. Children learned to ride before they could write. In fact, most could not write at all. But they could stay upright at a gallop by the time they were 5 or 6, guiding the animal with their knees while working a bow or a whip. Saddles were minimal, reins were loose. Trust, rather than force, was what kept horse and rider moving as one. Mobility defined everything. It wasn't just a lifestyle, it was a necessity. The central steppe zone, often called the Mongolian Manchurian grassland, receives between 200 and 400 millimeters of precipitation per year, mostly in summer. That means pasture land blooms and withers quickly. Stay too long in one place and your animals starve. Leave too early and you risk arriving at barren ground. So families moved. They followed invisible calendars, handed down orally, memorized through generations. Spring pasture, summer pasture, autumn retreat, winter camp. Each spot known, each migration mapped not with ink, but with hoofbeats and memory. Over time, these patterns carved out informal territories, guarded not with fences, but with presence. If your herd grazed where it should not, there would be trouble. Conflict was common. There were no unified borders, no permanent alliances, only shifting balances of power among clans and tribes. These groups were not static. They could be as small as a few extended families, or as large as a regional confederation. They changed names, merged through marriage or conquest, dissolved under pressure. Some of the names that survive in later chronicles, Kerit, Merkit, Naiman, Tatus, already existed in this pre-unification period, but their exact size and structure varied. Leadership tended to be hereditary within dominant lineages, but power was always fragile. A leader who failed to deliver pasture or protection could be abandoned. Authority came from charisma, wealth in animals, marriage alliances and control of trade routes, or sometimes simply from being the one who could keep everyone fed through a bad winter. Winters were brutal. Temperatures could drop below -40 degrees Celsius. Snowstorms, called zuds, could strip pasture bare or freeze animals alive. Entire herds could perish in a week. Families would then have to rely on stored milk products, dried meat, or the generosity or exploitation of neighbours. In years of scarcity, raids became common. A poor tribe might steal livestock from a wealthier one. Retaliation would follow. Cycles of vengeance and shifting power were part of life. There was no strong central authority to stop it, yet there was also community. Nomadic life fostered interdependence. Herding required cooperation. So did moving camp. Tents had to be raised together. Children were often raised collectively, passed between households, not unlike shared sheep or tools. Songs were taught around the fire. Stories preserved ancestral memory. Oral epics, sung in low, vibrating tones, could stretch for hours and recount hundreds of years. Most of the population could not read or write, but they could recite. They could remember. Religion was not housed in temples. It was breathed into the wind and sky. The spiritual system, commonly called Tengrism today, was more a lived worldview than a codified doctrine. At its centre was Tengri, the eternal blue sky, a kind of celestial order or divinity under which all things moved. But there were also earth spirits, ancestral spirits, and countless unseen forces. Shamans, often from specific family lines, served as mediators between the human and spirit worlds. They guided rituals, conducted healings, interpreted omens, and performed sacrifices. They wore robes decorated with iron, bone, and feathers, and sometimes masks or headdresses to disguise their human form while in trance. The drums they beat were more than music. They were tools of spiritual navigation. Offerings were made to the spirits of the land, especially before migrations or major decisions. Sacred mountains were honoured, trees tied with prayer flags, water sources approached with respect. Death was not final, but transitional. Bodies were buried in the earth or exposed to the elements, depending on the season, the cause, and the tradition of the tribe. Grave goods were common. Tools, weapons, jewellery, and sometimes animals accompanied the dead. But even in death, the emphasis was on balance, not grandeur. There were no pyramids, no written epitaphs. The steppe did not preserve kings. It preserved movement. Trade existed, though modestly. Wool, meat, hides, and horses were exchanged for metal tools, grains, or luxuries like tea and silk. Most trade occurred along seasonal routes, often with neighbouring sedentary societies in northern China or Central Asia. But wealth accumulation was limited. Without permanent buildings or secure vaults, surplus wealth was stored in animals or portable goods. There was no aristocratic class in the sense known to agricultural civilizations. Status was more fluid, tied to reputation, generosity, and clan loyalty. All of this, the pastoralism, the horse culture, the clan politics, the spiritual pragmatism, formed the invisible architecture of steppe life before recorded empire. There were no flags yet, no dynastic seals, no official borders, just hundreds of thousands of square kilometres of windswept grassland, dotted with yurts, herds, fires, and humans trying, with each season, to hold their world together. And yet, despite the lack of cities, despite the absence of formal institutions, this world was not backwards. It was not primitive. It was adaptive, resilient, and astonishingly efficient at surviving in a landscape that offered little margin for error. In fact, it may have been this very lack of fixedness, this deep cultural relationship with mobility, that enabled what came next. For when history turned, and the tribes of the Mongolian plateau began to unify under a single vision, they would not need to learn how to move. They had already been moving for centuries. What changed was that they began to move in the same direction. But before that could happen, a society had to be born that was not just mobile, but deeply attuned to mobility as a way of thinking. A society that built no cities but mastered logistics, that had no standing armies but raised warriors from childhood, that lacked written law codes but maintained a complex network of taboos, loyalties and oaths, that worshipped the sky not with monuments, but with silence. And so, the question lingers, how does a world built for survival become a world ready for conquest? What flicker of shared identity, what storm of ambition or desperation begins the transformation from herder to empire? We are not there yet, but the wind is rising, and the horses are already saddled. How do you turn a dozen warring tribes into a world empire? Not with banners, not with speeches, and not all at once. The story of Temujin, the man the world would later call Genghis Khan, is not one of sudden conquest or mythic birth. It is the slow, brutal, deeply personal process of surviving a fragmented world long enough to stitch it together. And that world, before it was called an empire, was a chaos of camps and rival clans, blood debts and winter starvation, shifting alliances, forgotten names, and rules written only in memory. The Mongolian plateau, in the second half of the 12th century, was not a blank slate waiting to be unified. It was a tangled knot of grudges, kinships, and competing claims to leadership. It was a place where no one trusted anyone for long. Temujin was born into that, somewhere between the years 1155 and 1167. Even this we cannot say with certainty. The records are late, and they are shaped by politics and legend. What we do know is that he was born into the Borjigin clan, one of many minor lineages claiming descent from the mythical blue wolf and white doe of Mongol folklore. His father, Yesugei, was a chieftain with modest influence, known more for his connections than his armies. He was poisoned, according to later accounts, by a rival tribe while Temujin was still a boy. And with that death, whatever standing the family had vanished. What followed was exile. Temujin's mother, Hulun, was left to raise her children alone. They were abandoned by their allies, stripped of their herds, forced to live by fishing, foraging and trapping rodents for meat. The early life of Temujin was not princely. It was desperate. And yet through this early hardship a pattern begins to form, a relentless effort to rebuild, not by declaring power, but by slowly accumulating loyalty. He began, like many in his world, with blood ties. He married young, as was customary, to Berta of the Ongurat tribe. That alliance would later prove essential, not just emotionally, but politically. When Berta was kidnapped by the Merkit, one of the rival tribal groups, Temujin formed a rescue alliance with his blood brother Jamuka and a powerful chieftain named Tokrul, also known as Wang Khan. Together they defeated the Merkits, and Berta was recovered. This episode is more than personal. It is the moment Temujin steps beyond the confines of his birth clan and begins to build coalitions, using both kinship and calculated reciprocity. But alliances on the steppe were brittle. Jamuka, once his closest companion, would become his most bitter enemy. Their paths split as their visions diverged. Temujin favoured a more merit-based order, promoting allies regardless of their birth rank. Jamuka, aligned with more traditional aristocratic factions, saw this as a betrayal of noble lineage. In the year 1187, they clashed in what would be the first of several confrontations. Temujin was defeated and fled, but he did not disappear. Over the next decade he gathered strength. His model of leadership began to attract those left behind by the older systems, orphans, outcasts, former slaves, and ambitious men from minor families. His camp became a kind of social refuge for those disillusioned with hereditary privilege. He reorganized military units into decimal-based structures, groups of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. each with appointed leaders selected for loyalty and competence, not lineage. These units would later become the backbone of Mongol military efficiency, but even before conquest they served as a social tool. They flattened hierarchy, they bound men together through obligation, identity and shared survival. By the turn of the 13th century, Temujin had established himself as a power not to be ignored. His alliance with Togrul of the Kherite had secured access to trade routes and resources. His reputation for generosity, particularly in redistributing loot to his followers, made him increasingly popular among the lower ranks of the steppe. But old rivalries simmered. In 1196 he was ambushed by Jamuka and a coalition of traditionalist tribes. Captured soldiers from Temujin's camp were reportedly executed by boiling, an act intended to send a message. But the message backfired. Over the next 10 years, Temujin rebuilt once more, drawing in even more defectors, absorbing clans piece by piece, until the balance tipped again. In the year 1201, Temujin and Jamuka fought what would be their final battle. This time, Temujin won. Jamuka was captured. According to some sources, he was offered a position in Temujin's administration, but refused. He was executed, reportedly without torture, out of respect for his old friendship. Whether this mercy was fact or invention, it signals something about the emerging ideology of the man now poised to claim something more than tribal leadership. In the spring of the year 1206, a grand assembly of tribal leaders was held near the Onon River. The gathering, known as a Kurultai, marked the formal recognition of Temujin's supremacy over the now unified Mongol tribes. He was given the title Genghis Khan, often rendered as Genghis Khan in Western texts. The exact meaning of Chinggis is debated. It may derive from the Mongol word for universal, or possibly oceanic, implying vastness. What is clear is that this was a title of ambition, not geography. He was no longer merely a Khan among Khans, he was the Khan, but with recognition came responsibility. Ruling a coalition of tribes that had spent centuries fighting each other required more than charisma, it required structure. Around this time, Genghis Khan began to codify a set of laws and customs into what would later be called the Yasa. This was not a written legal code in the way Roman or Chinese law was. Rather, it was a flexible, evolving set of decrees enforced by his appointees and remembered orally. The Yasa emphasized discipline, loyalty, military readiness, and the sanctity of oaths. It included prohibitions on theft, adultery and betrayal, and laid out protocols for military organization, communication and taxation. It even regulated hunting seasons and animal slaughter, reflecting the ecological realities of life on the steppe. The Yasa was as much ideology as policy. It reinforced the values that had elevated Temujin to power, merit, loyalty and service to a greater whole. It also served to suppress the older aristocratic networks that had opposed him. Those who joined him were rewarded, sometimes elevated far above their birth status. Those who resisted were eliminated or absorbed. Clan names began to matter less. Service to the Khan began to matter more. Temujin also demonstrated a talent for diplomacy. He sent emissaries to distant tribes, offering alliances sealed by marriage or mutual protection. He tolerated religious differences, integrated conquered peoples into his administration, and maintained strict codes of conduct for his envoys. Violation of those envoys, as would later be seen in devastating clarity, was considered an insult to his authority and an invitation to annihilation. But in these early years, within the borders of what is now Mongolia, his greatest challenge was not expansion, it was cohesion. Unifying people who had never considered themselves part of the same polity required more than force, it required a narrative. The narrative Temujin offered was one of shared struggle and shared destiny. He cast the older tribal wars as obsolete. The time of disunity had ended. The steppe would now move with one breath, one banner, one law, his law. It is difficult to overstate what an achievement this was. No previous leader had managed to bind so many Mongol and Turkic tribes into a single, stable entity. Most attempts had collapsed within a generation, undone by ego, geography, or famine. Temujin, by contrast, created a structure flexible enough to survive his absence. He understood succession, he designated heirs, he created councils, and he made sure no clan, not even his own, could dominate unchecked. Of course, this unity did not erase conflict. Rivalries still simmered, Betrayals would come. But for the first time, the Mongolian plateau was not a battlefield of scattered tribes. It was a launch pad. What followed? The conquests, the campaigns, the global reshaping of trade and culture was only possible because of what happened in these years of unification. The empire began not with a war, but with a reorganization of the human landscape. A new way of being mobile together, and yet the haunting question remains: what makes a man want to unify a world that had taught him only division? Was it vengeance? Was it vision? Was it survival, scaled up to its most ambitious form? We may never know. But we do know that by the end of the year 1206 the world had gained a new name, Genghis Khan. And the steppe, once fractured, now stood as a single breath, inhaling sharply. Just before the storm, why did the walls stop working? For centuries they had stood as symbols of permanence, of protection, of civilization's boundary against the wilderness beyond. Stone and earth stacked high enough to repel arrows, deep enough to slow fire, thick enough to outlast siege. Across northern China, from the edge of the Gobi Desert to the Yellow River Basin, walled cities marked the frontier between settled empires and the shifting tapestry of nomadic clans beyond the horizon. But something changed in the early years of the 13th century. The walls held, but the people behind them surrendered. Not always quickly, but eventually, and often completely. And the force that swept through them did not begin as an army in the traditional sense. It began with riders. From the year 1206 onward, the Mongol world was no longer confined to the steppe. With his authority now recognized by the major tribes of the Mongolian plateau, Genghis Khan began to look outward. His first major target was not a continent or a civilization, but a neighbour, the Western Sia dynasty, known in Mongol as the Tanguts. Their lands bordered the Ordos Loop of the Yellow River, controlling key trade routes and fertile pastures along the frontier. The Tanguts had walled cities, organised administration, a written script, and long-standing traditions of tribute and diplomacy, with both Song China to the south and the Jin dynasty to the east. But they had never faced a threat quite like this. The first Mongol campaigns into Sia territory began around the year 1207 and intensified over the next several years. These were not symbolic raids or punitive expeditions, they were tests. The Mongols had never fought against large fortified cities before. On the steppe, there were no stone walls. Raids were swift, targets were soft, and territory was defined by movement. But now they encountered a system built for endurance. Cities with gates, with battlements, with thick walls of tamped earth and brick. At first, the Mongols had no siege engines, no formal engineering corps, no experience with long-term encirclement. What they had was time, horses, and the ability to adapt. Rather than launching direct assaults, the Mongols did what they knew best. They waited. They surrounded cities in their traditional nomadic style, setting up mobile camps at key access points, cutting off supply lines, and denying movement in or out. The siege of Yinchuan, the western Xia capital, became a case study. Unable to breach the walls, the Mongols flooded the surrounding area by diverting a river, hoping the rising waters would force a surrender. It didn't work exactly as planned. The flood damaged their own camp and forced them to adapt once more. But the message was clear. The Mongols were willing to experiment. They didn't need immediate victory. They needed control. Over time, they began to incorporate Chinese and Central Asian engineers, captured specialists who knew how to build siege towers, traction trebuchets, and other tools of urban warfare. What they lacked in formal schooling, they made up for in pragmatism. Genghis Khan was not attached to any one method of conquest. He was attached to results. If surrounding a city for months worked, he would wait. If psychological terror worked faster, he would use it, and it did work. The Mongols became masters of psychological warfare. When they approached a city, they often offered a choice: surrender and be spared, or resist and be destroyed. Cities that surrendered early were sometimes left intact, their leadership replaced but their citizens unharmed, but cities that resisted, especially after receiving fair warning, were often annihilated. Entire populations could be executed. The goal was not cruelty for its own sake, it was deterrence. Stories of total destruction travelled faster than horses. The fall of one city might cause the next to open its gates without a fight. The Jin dynasty, which ruled much of northern China from its capital at Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, soon realised the danger. The Jin were a Jurchen-led state, originally from Manchuria, with a hybrid administrative system blending steppe traditions and Chinese bureaucratic models. They had a formidable army, well-defended cities, and a long history of managing nomadic threats through a mix of bribery, alliances, and force. But the Mongols did not behave like previous threats. They didn't follow predictable patterns, they didn't stop for tribute, and they moved too quickly to contain. Between the years 1211 and 1214, Mongol forces swept through Jin borderlands, capturing fortresses, looting towns, and testing imperial responses. In many cases, they bypassed the strongest defences, targeting softer targets to erode morale and provoke panic. Their supply lines were minimal. They lived off the land, hunted for food, and carried dried provisions. Each warrior travelled with several horses, allowing for constant rotation and unmatched endurance. This logistical mobility allowed them to strike where least expected, disappear into the steppe, then return weeks later from an entirely different direction. The Mongol bow, compact and composite, gave them range and lethality unmatched by any contemporary cavalry. Their formations were fluid. Feigned retreats lured defenders into pursuit, only to be surrounded and cut down by hidden detachments. Scouts moved far ahead of the main force, gathering intelligence, mapping terrain, and probing weaknesses. Every campaign became a lesson, every enemy a teacher. And the Mongols learned quickly. In the winter of 1214 to 1215, they made their boldest move yet. They marched on Zhongdu itself. It was a massive undertaking. The Jin capital was heavily fortified, with high walls, strong gates, and a substantial garrison. The Mongols lacked the manpower for a full siege, and they had never before attacked a city of this scale. But they committed anyway. The surrounding countryside was devastated, supply routes cut, and the city isolated. Siege engines, likely built by captured engineers, were deployed against the walls. Fires raged, food supplies dwindled, the defenders fought hard, but their strength was sapped by the pressure of isolation and the knowledge of what might come. Eventually, in the summer of 1215, the city surrendered. The aftermath was brutal. Historical records suggest mass executions, plunder and destruction on a scale rarely seen before. The city was burned, survivors were scattered, and the message was sent. What mattered in these early campaigns was not just territory, but transformation. The Mongols were not simply plundering for profit, they were testing models of conquest, and what they discovered was that walls could not stop momentum. If a city relied on being impassable, and that defence failed even once, its aura of invincibility vanished. Walls depended on belief. Once that belief cracked, entire regions began to fall in anticipation rather than resistance. We should be careful, though, not to oversimplify this as brute force. The Mongol campaigns into Western Jia and Jin territory were brutal, yes, but they were also strategic, adaptive, and built on a foundation of careful learning. Genghis Khan took what the steppe had taught him, resilience, mobility, endurance, and applied it to an entirely new context. His army was not just a wave of horsemen, it was a thinking organism capable of adjusting to siege warfare, absorbing foreign techniques, and scaling its operations far beyond what any previous nomadic confederation had attempted. The early campaigns into China revealed something that would define the Mongol expansion for decades to come, the fusion of steppe dynamism with the tools of sedentary conquest. The Mongols did not bring siegecraft from home, they took it from those they defeated. They did not invent administration, but they understood its usefulness. Every conquered city became a source of knowledge. Every captive artisan or engineer became a new asset. This was not conquest in the image of the past. It was conquest as evolution. And yet, for all their adaptation, the Mongols retained their essential character. They remained mobile, loosely centralized, built on personal loyalty rather than bureaucratic hierarchy. They retained their seasonal rhythms, their reverence for the sky, their codes of behavior on campaign. The empire that began to emerge was not a copy of China, but something else entirely. It was a moving empire, always expanding, always learning, never static. By the end of the year 1215, the Mongols had shattered the illusion of security in northern China. Western Xia had been humbled, the Jin dynasty was reeling, and the myth of the invincible city wall was in ruins, so perhaps the question is not why the wall stopped working. Perhaps the better question is, How do you defend a world built on stillness against an enemy made of motion? What happens when you kill a Mongol envoy? In a world as vast and volatile as the one that stretched from the plains of Mongolia to the markets of Persia, it was a question with very specific consequences. Not a metaphor, not a warning, a measurable event. Because when a Mongol envoy was killed in the early 13th century, the response was not legal action or retaliatory trade sanctions. It was annihilation. Not of a city or a province or a government, but of an entire civilization. What followed was not a campaign. It was a retribution that became a case study in imperial vengeance, military logistics, and the terrible efficiency of Mongol strategy at scale. The war with the Khwarezmian Empire was not just one of the bloodiest episodes of Genghis Khan's conquests. It was also the moment the world began to understand what happened when you confused diplomacy for weakness. By the year 1218, Genghis Khan's empire had expanded from the eastern steppe into northern China. Western Xia had been subjugated. The Jin dynasty was reeling. But the Khan's attention was already shifting westward, not toward conquest, at first, but toward commerce. The Khwarezmian Empire, stretching across modern-day Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and parts of Afghanistan, was one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world at the time. Its cities, like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Nishapur, were wealthy centres of trade, learning, and architecture. Caravans passed through them bearing goods from India, Arabia, the Caucasus, and the eastern steppes. They were gateways between civilizations. Genghis Khan did not open this relationship with swords, he opened it with camels. A trade mission was sent from the Mongol capital across the Central Asian deserts, laden with silver, gold, textiles, and gifts intended to initiate peaceful commerce. These caravans were accompanied by envoys who carried letters of introduction and formal requests for diplomatic relations. It was a gesture not of subordination, but of parity. The Mongols were announcing themselves as a power worth trading with. The Khwarezmian Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, was not impressed. Historical records suggest he viewed the Mongols as a backward tribal confederation, skilled in war perhaps, but not worthy of equal treatment. When the caravan arrived at the border town of Otrar, the local governor accused the merchants of espionage, seized their goods, and executed them. Genghis Khan responded with restraint. He sent 3 official envoys to the Shah directly, demanding justice and the punishment of the governor. Instead, the Shah had one of the envoys beheaded and the others mutilated. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a message, and the Mongols understood it. What followed has no precise parallel in medieval history. Over the next 3 years, from the autumn of 1218 to the spring of 1221, Genghis Khan mobilized one of the largest and most coordinated military campaigns of the 13th century. Some sources estimate 200,000 troops, though actual numbers are difficult to verify. What is certain is that the army was divided into highly mobile columns, each with specific objectives, converging at key points with astonishing synchronicity. The goal was not merely to defeat the Khwarezmian army, it was to dismantle the empire entirely. The first blow came with the siege of Otrar, the same city that had hosted the fatal caravan. Mongol forces surrounded it for several months. When they breached the walls, they sacked it thoroughly. The governor, Inalchuk, was captured, and according to some accounts, executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and mouth. Whether this story is true or not, it reflects the tone of the campaign: deliberate, symbolic, and unforgiving. From there, the Mongols advanced rapidly. Their forces split and reconvened, attacking multiple cities in parallel, preventing coordinated resistance. One army moved south toward Bukhara, while another targeted Samarkand. Both cities were rich, fortified, and populated by scholars, merchants, and craftsmen. Bukhara fell first. The Mongols approached under the cover of winter storms, arriving faster than anticipated. The city gates were opened by terrified citizens. The mosque was used as a command centre. Genghis Khan reportedly addressed the gathered populace, declaring that he had been sent by heaven as punishment for their rulers' sins. The city was then looted. Much of the population was killed or enslaved. The walls were left intact, but the spirit of the city was broken. Samarkand followed soon after. It was the jewel of the Khwarezmian Empire, a cultural and administrative hub with a strong garrison and defensive walls. The Mongols surrounded it with disciplined precision, blocking exits, targeting water supplies, and using siege engines to breach the fortifications. The defenders fought hard, but the outcome was inevitable. When the city fell, the Mongols separated artisans and specialists for resettlement. The rest of the population, tens of thousands, was massacred. There are varying reports about the scale, but the message was clear. Resistance would not be tolerated. The Shah himself fled. First to Nishapur, then to the Caspian coast, and finally to an island where he died of illness and humiliation in 1220. His empire, built through decades of regional expansion, collapsed within a few seasons. His court dissolved, his armies scattered, his cities burned. The Mongols did not occupy the territory in the traditional sense, they dismantled it. They took what was useful, craftsmen, engineers, interpreters, and left ashes where power had once resided. What made this campaign so effective was not just brutality, it was planning. The Mongols coordinated movements across thousands of kilometres, using prearranged signals, messenger relays, and detailed intelligence gathered in advance. Their logistics were decentralised but coherent. Units could forage independently, live off the land, and regroup without central supply lines. Their tactics evolved with each battle, adapting to terrain, resistance, and available technologies. The Mongols used feigned retreats to lure defenders into traps. They bypassed strongholds when necessary and returned later. They spared cities that surrendered early, using them as staging points for further advances. But once betrayal or resistance was confirmed, the response was total. There are moments in history when warfare becomes something else, when it ceases to be a contest of armies and becomes instead a form of messaging. The Khwarezmian campaign was one of those moments. The Mongols were not just defeating an enemy, they were establishing a precedent. The price of killing an envoy, of breaking the laws of diplomatic immunity, was not retaliation in kind. It was civilizational extinction, and here we should pause, because it is tempting to read this story as evidence of a uniquely ruthless culture, but that would miss the context. The Mongols were operating in a world where betrayal was common, where borders were fluid, where communication across distance was unreliable, and where reputation could be more powerful than law. The violence they inflicted was, in their eyes, a form of moral enforcement. They had offered peace. They had sent gifts. They had followed the code of envoys. That code had been violated, and the response was scaled accordingly. We can debate the ethics. We can recoil at the scale. But what remains historically clear is that the destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire reshaped the political landscape of Central Asia. It erased a major power from the map. It opened corridors for future campaigns deeper into the Islamic world. It sent a signal to Europe, India, and the Levant that a new force had emerged from the east, one not bound by old treaties or expectations. And yet, this campaign, for all its fire and thunder, was not the end point. It was the beginning of something even larger. The Mongols had proven they could project power across deserts, rivers, and mountains. They had demonstrated that their model of mobility, discipline, and strategic ruthlessness could overcome wealth, walls, and numerical disadvantage. But in doing so, they also began to realize that conquest alone was not enough. Cities, even in ruins, left behind ghosts of trade, of knowledge, of systems worth preserving. And that realization would shape the next phase of their expansion. Still, the haunting question remains: what if the Shah had punished the governor? What if he had received the envoys with caution instead of arrogance? What if, instead of seeing the Mongols as barbarians, he had seen them as equals, or at least as dangerous? We do not know. What we do know is that a single diplomatic failure, a single moment of insult, unravelled an empire, and the dust has never fully settled. How do you conquer winter? Not metaphorically, not with fur-lined optimism or heroic metaphors, but practically, physically. With supply lines that freeze, rivers that vanish under ice, horses that collapse mid-step, fingers that blacken and break in the wind. Most empires in history have feared winter. They retreated from it, avoided it, or tried to outlast it with stores of grain and promises of spring. But in the early 13th century, a new kind of army crossed the Eurasian steppe and entered the forests and river valleys of what we now call Russia. They didn't avoid the cold, they adapted to it, and in doing so they conquered not just cities and peoples, but the season itself. The Mongol campaigns into the lands of the Russes were not a singular invasion. They were a series of calculated penetrations over the span of nearly 2 decades, beginning in the late 1220s and culminating in the devastating siege of Kiev in the early 1240s. These were not raids, they were structured advances, directed by commanders who understood terrain, timing, and the logistical constraints of distance. Chief among these commanders was Subutai, a general whose name may not ring through the halls of popular history like others, but whose legacy remains among the most extraordinary feats of strategic movement in medieval warfare. Subutai was not a prince. He was not born into a noble clan. He rose through the ranks on merit, talent, and relentless competence. By the time the Mongol campaigns reached the Western Steppe, Subutai had already played key roles in the wars against the Western Seer, the Jin dynasty, and the Khwarezmian Empire. But the campaign against the Rus would test a different kind of ability, not just tactical ingenuity, but environmental adaptation. The lands of the Rus in the 13th century were fragmented principalities: Kievan Rus, Vladimir Suzdal, Ryazan, Novgorod, each ruled by local princes, often in conflict with one another, sometimes cooperating, rarely unified. Their terrain was a patchwork of thick forests, swampy plains, and frozen rivers. Their cities were built of wood more than stone, with earthen ramparts and fortified monasteries rather than massive walls. Their armies relied heavily on infantry, supplemented by noble cavalry. And most importantly, they were not expecting what came. The Mongols had scouted the region as early as the 1220s. These early movements were not full invasions, but reconnaissance in force. They probed river crossings, tested local responses, and mapped key cities. Subutai, alongside fellow General Jebi, conducted a famous deep raid through the Caucasus and into the Kipchak steppe, defeating both nomadic and settled forces. This wasn't random aggression, it was pattern recognition. Subutai was learning what this strange new landscape could offer, and what it offered, paradoxically, was winter. Most armies of the time considered the frozen months unsuitable for campaigning. Supply was difficult, roads turned to ice or mud, horses suffered. But the Mongols saw opportunity. Rivers that normally served as barriers, wide, sluggish, and prone to flooding, became highways when frozen. The Volga, the Dnieper, the Don. In summer they slowed movement. In winter they sped it up. Armies could ride across them, directly into the heart of enemy territory, avoiding roads, fortresses, and known choke points. By the year 1237, the Mongols were ready. Under the authority of Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis, but with Subutai directing much of the actual planning, they launched a multi-pronged assault on the principalities of the Rus. Their first major target was Ryazan. The city was besieged and destroyed after 5 days of fighting. Its inhabitants were massacred. Survivors were few. Then came Kolomna, then Moscow, then Vladimir. Each city fell despite pleas for help from neighbouring rulers. Coordination among the Rus was poor. Distrust ran deep. No unified defence emerged. Subutai's strategy was to hit hard and fast, keep units light and mobile, and move on before any resistance could consolidate. He divided his forces into separate columns, each with designated targets, converging at prearranged points, like a net tightening from multiple directions. He used terrain to his advantage, avoided strong points when unnecessary, and preserved the core strength of his cavalry by minimizing drawn-out sieges. But the most haunting blow came in the year 1240, with the approach to Kiev. The city, once the spiritual and political centre of Kievan Rus, had fallen into relative decline but remained symbolically important. It was large, defended, and built near the confluence of key rivers. The Mongols approached in winter. The Dnieper was frozen, roads were buried under snow, and yet the army moved like water. They encircled the city, cutting off escape. Siege engines were constructed from local timber. The walls were battered, the gates breached. The inhabitants resisted fiercely, but it did not matter. The fall of Kiev was not just a military event, it was psychological. Chroniclers record the destruction in apocalyptic terms. Churches burned, manuscripts lost, civilians slaughtered, the city reduced to ashes and silence. Whether these accounts were exaggerated by grief or shaped by later memory is difficult to say, but the outcome was undeniable. Kiev was no longer a centre of power. The Mongols did not simply defeat the Rus, they broke their spine, and they did it in snow, in sub-zero temperatures, over rivers that had become runways. This is what made the campaign so unique. The Mongols did not merely survive winter, they used it as an asset. Their horses were adapted to cold, their supplies were carried in mobile packs, their tactics emphasized speed, flexibility, and minimal baggage. They did not rely on fixed supply lines vulnerable to disruption. They moved like a weather system, unpredictable, unyielding, and difficult to counter. There are moments in this campaign that stretch belief. The crossing of the Carpathians in deep winter, the coordination of multiple armies hundreds of kilometres apart, with no modern communication tools, the ability to maintain discipline and coherence despite snow, hunger, and exhaustion. And yet the archaeological and textual evidence suggests it happened. City after city fell, fortress after fortress crumbled, and the Mongols kept moving. It would be a mistake to frame this campaign as purely destruction. The Mongols, as always, spared artisans, engineers, and those with skills they could use. They resettled populations, they absorbed knowledge, and in the years that followed, they would establish administrative centres, tribute systems, and indirect rule through compliant princes. But in these first years, from the late 1220s to the early 1240s, the focus was not on governance, it was on demonstration. By the end of the campaign, the principalities of the Rus were no longer autonomous in any meaningful sense. Some continued to exist, but only as vassals. Others faded entirely. The political landscape was remade. Power shifted northward toward Moscow and Novgorod. Trade routes were redirected. Tribute began to flow eastward, and the memory of Mongol winter warfare lingered for centuries. What makes this episode so compelling is not just the violence or the tactics, but the environmental inversion. Winter, which for most of history had acted as a defensive season, became the Mongols' ally. They were not immune to its effects, but they worked with it, rather than against it. Frozen rivers became highways, snow-covered plains became neutral ground. Their resilience was not superhuman, it was practical. They brought what they needed, they didn't bring what they didn't, and they moved quickly enough that the season couldn't catch them. Subutai, the architect of much of this campaign, would go on to lead further operations across Eastern Europe. But his triumph in the Russian campaign remains one of the clearest examples of adaptive warfare in pre-modern history. He didn't invent new weapons. He didn't command overwhelming numbers. What he did was see the world differently. Not as a map of obstacles, but as a landscape of possibilities. And so we return to the question, how do you conquer winter? You don't beat it. You ride it. And if you're fast enough, disciplined enough, and patient enough, you might leave behind not just bones in the snow, but empires in your wake. How did they always know? How did the Mongols, a people without printing presses, without compasses, without global maps or centralized universities, seem to strike with surgical precision across a continent they did not build? How did mounted riders from the steppe appear where they shouldn't be? Always at the weakest point, always one day before the defence arrived. And how, in the middle of the 13th century, did a society that moved by horse construct something that almost resembled an internet? The short answer is this: they mapped everything, and they never stopped moving. But before we imagine spies or clever scouts in the modern sense, it's worth remembering what information looked like on the steppe. It did not arrive on paper. It did not travel in books. It rode on horseback, in memory, in code, in gossip, in tribute, and often in song. Knowledge was oral. Authority was local. Geography was lived, not measured. And that made what the Mongol Empire eventually built all the more astonishing. It began, as most things did in this world, with necessity. Steppe life had always been shaped by movement and survival. When you live on land with no fences, where herds roam and seasons rotate the value of a place, you need to know who controls which patch of grass, when a valley floods, where water hides after snowmelt, and which clans have traded here before. This kind of ecological memory, half myth, half map, was already embedded in the culture of the Mongol tribes long before Temujin ever rose to unify them. But what changed after the foundation of the empire was scale. Suddenly, memory wasn't enough. You needed information systems, you needed fast updates, and most importantly, you needed logistics, so they built it. A network. At first, it was simple. Riders stationed at regular intervals with fresh horses and food. These outposts formed what came to be known as the Yam, a relay system of mounted couriers stretching across thousands of kilometres of imperial territory. If you held an official garige, a sort of passport or authority token, you could travel between posts, receive shelter, and pass information at the speed of gallop. No empire of that size had ever moved data faster. By the mid-13th century, there were thousands of these relay stations operating across the Mongol world. The system functioned a bit like blood vessels in a body. Messages pulsed outward from the imperial centre and came rushing back in again, always moving, always pulsing, giving the Khan's court near real-time awareness of rebellions, weather conditions, border breaches and tribute delays. But this wasn't just about news, it was also about maps. One of the great ironies of Mongol history is that, for a people often mischaracterised as anti-civilization, the Mongols were obsessive surveyors. Wherever they went, they measured, and where they couldn't measure, they asked. Cartographers were recruited or coerced from conquered territories. Chinese, Persian and Turkic mapmakers were brought to the imperial court, not just to draw, but to educate Mongol officials in geography, climate, road systems and fortification layouts. There's even evidence that the Mongols conducted pre-conquest reconnaissance in the form of trade missions, disguised diplomats and strategic intermarriages. Long before an army crossed into foreign land, Mongol strategists often had a reasonably accurate picture of its terrain, its defences, and its political weaknesses. They knew where the river crossed the road, they knew how far a city's garrison could ride in 2 days, they knew which gates were stone and which were wood, and they knew which tribes hated each other. This information was then distilled, sometimes literally. One account describes maps being drawn not just on paper, but on pieces of cloth, scrolls of bark and even skin. The Mongols were not attached to medium, they were attached to mobility. What mattered was that data travelled. What mattered was that information, once acquired, could be used by men on horseback. But the Mongols were not just collecting geography, they were collecting people. Ethnographers, though they wouldn't have called them that, were sent into new regions to catalogue populations, customs, dialects, belief systems and economic roles. This wasn't science in the modern sense, it was empirecraft. If you knew which group made pottery, which group harvested millet, and which local healer had sway over a region's sickness rituals, you had the blueprint for pacification, taxation and control. And yet, this wasn't entirely exploitative. Mongol rulers were often deeply pragmatic about the knowledge they encountered. Instead of forcing one language or one religion, they incorporated systems from everywhere. They hired Nestorian Christian scribes, Persian viziers, and Buddhist astrologers. In many ways, the Mongol court became an information sponge, absorbing any technique that might stabilize or extend power. Still, the foundation of it all was movement. Knowledge did not sit on shelves, it galloped. Men memorized road networks, administrators travelled with translators, officials rotated between distant posts to prevent corruption, even tribute caravans became learning tools. A shipment of silk from southern China didn't just deliver fabric, it came with port records, harvest numbers, and rumours, and all of it flowed back into the centre. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire had achieved something quietly extraordinary. A semi-centralised intelligence infrastructure that could operate across almost half the known world without the need for static capital cities or a literate population. They had built a mind out of riders, a nervous system of galloping scribes, a weather map made of rumour, reinforced by scouts and drawn by cartographers taken from 3 continents. And in this world, no wall was high enough. Because the Mongols didn't just break through stone, they anticipated it. They arrived before you expected. They flanked, surrounded, waited, and starved you not by force of will, but by accuracy. The great weapon of the Mongol Empire was not the bow. It was knowledge. Not secret, mystical knowledge. Just working information. Where are the rivers? Who holds the grain? Which governor is corrupt? What language do the villagers speak? The empire, in short, became intelligent, and yet no archive survives. Most of what we know about Mongol intelligence systems comes from foreign chroniclers, Chinese bureaucratic records, and the few imperial decrees that were carved in stone or quoted by others. The Mongols did not preserve their information legacy in the same way other empires did. They preserved it through velocity, so the haunting question remains, what did they know that we don't? because somewhere out there, galloping between distant outposts, was a body of knowledge that made it possible to rule the world by horse, a system of silent observers, of measuring minds, of maps carried in muscle memory. And if we listen closely to the chronicles, the trade records, the suspiciously accurate Mongol ambushes, it's clear that someone somewhere had already drawn the route. The Mongols simply followed it. Can an empire without cities still have a constitution? That's the riddle of the Mongol world. No permanent capital, no marble forum, no great temple to house the rules, just wind and hooves and silence. And yet, this empire of tents somehow stitched itself together with law, a law few saw written, a law many feared, a law that crossed languages and lifeways and still, somehow, held. They called it the yasa, or rather others did. The Mongols themselves rarely bothered to explain it. The yasa was never carved into stone like Hammurabi's code. It was not chanted in courtrooms or taught in village schools. It was remembered, whispered, enforced. More method than manuscript, it functioned not as a rigid legal document, but as a behavioural lattice, and something flexible enough to move with the empire, but hard enough to hit you when you stepped out of line. Where did it come from? That part is still debated. Most sources suggest that Temujin, after unifying the Mongol tribes around the year 1206 of the Common Era, gathered his leaders in a great council and laid down a new code of conduct, a way to bind former enemies into a single moving organism. The rules were compiled, adjusted, sometimes invented, and passed down through generations of officials, soldiers, translators, and tax collectors. The original text, if there ever was one, is lost, but the idea of it remains, and for over a century it helped hold the largest land empire in human history together, not with shared ethnicity or religion, but with a code of action. At its heart, the yasa was about loyalty. Loyalty to the Khan, loyalty to the order, loyalty to the idea that even in a world of shifting landscapes and borrowed cities, some lines could not be crossed. Betrayal was punished with death, disobedience, often the same. But there was logic in the cruelty. This was not randomness. It was architecture. One of the most remarkable things about the yasa was its scope. It governed not just the behaviour of Mongols, but also of subject peoples, foreign traders, governors, diplomats, and even conquered kings. It regulated hunting seasons. It set expectations for hospitality. It banned theft and adultery and even some forms of gossip. The Mongols, it turns out, were deeply concerned with honour, not the romantic kind, but the kind that makes an army work. You obeyed the chain of command. You took your share, not more. You didn't question orders in battle, and if you did, you vanished. But there was another side to the yasa, one that historians have often overlooked. It wasn't just about violence, it was also about order. In a world of sudden conquest and cultural chaos, the yasa gave people a framework, a way to anticipate the rules, a structure to interact with a ruling class that didn't look or speak like them. For many subject peoples, especially traders, craftsmen, and city dwellers, Mongol law was not a nightmare. It was surprisingly stable, tolerant even. Because here's the paradox. The same empire that could wipe out a city in rage was also one of the most religiously tolerant powers of the medieval world. Under the yasa, Buddhist monks, Christian priests, Muslim imams, and Jewish rabbis were all permitted to worship and to teach. In many cases, they were even exempt from taxation. The Mongols, as a rule, did not force conversion. They didn't care what gods you prayed to, as long as you paid your tribute, stayed loyal, and didn't incite rebellion. And this tolerance wasn't just spiritual, it was legal. Local customs were often allowed to continue, as long as they didn't contradict the core tenets of Mongol order. That meant Persian administrators could still collect taxes in Persian ways. Chinese officials could run their bureaucracies with familiar forms. The yasa didn't erase other legal systems, it overlaid them, a topsoil of control across a continent of roots, but control had to be enforced, and that brings us to one of the empire's most feared instruments, the jarguchi, or imperial judge. These were roving enforcers, often of noble birth, trained to adjudicate disputes, enforce yasa law, and sometimes to deliver sentence on the spot. Their presence was both judicial and symbolic. If a Jaguchi arrived in your town, it meant the empire was watching, and if your appeal reached the Great Khan himself, a rare but documented event, it meant your fate would be weighed not by local whim, but by the full machinery of Mongol justice. Still, justice wasn't blind. It was sharp-eyed and pragmatic. Penalties were harsh, but predictable. And predictability, in an empire this wide, was power. If a merchant from Baghdad could expect the same legal protection in Samarkand as in Karakoram, that wasn't kindness, that was infrastructure, and it paid off. The Mongol tax system, though feared, was surprisingly efficient. Tribute demands were calibrated to local capacity. Quotas were enforced through census records, not always accurate, but enough to keep pressure on. Tax collectors were often appointed from the conquered populations themselves, creating a strange hybrid administration in which locals enforced foreign rule. And while corruption did exist, as it always does, the threat of imperial punishment kept many officials surprisingly honest. What made this system function was consistency. You could ride from the Volga River to the Yellow Sea and pass through dozens of cultures, landscapes and languages, but the laws of the Khan would still reach you. You could be a camel driver from Bukhara or a monk from Tibet. If you broke Mongol law, the punishment was clear, and that clarity, paradoxically, built trust. But there's something else worth noting. For all its reach and rigidity, the yasa was not eternal. It changed, it adapted. It was reinterpreted by different Khans, rephrased by different scribes, and moulded to meet new political realities. What Temujin laid down in the early 13th century may have been quite different by the time of Kublai Khan in the late 1200s, but the idea that law could transcend tribe, that loyalty could replace lineage, that an empire could gallop on the back of shared rules, that idea persisted. So in the end, maybe the question isn't whether the Mongols had a constitution. Maybe the question is how they managed to make one work without printing it. In a world without paper empires, they ruled with memory, with precedent, with punishment, and yes, with surprising pockets of mercy. The yasa remains one of the most enigmatic legal systems in history, half myth, half machinery, a framework that held together a world on horseback. No monuments survive to its clauses, no scrolls list its full contents, but its echoes remain in chronicles and tax records, in rumours and respect, and somewhere, in the windswept distances between yurts and burned cities, the idea still floats. That law, even when invisible, can hold an empire together, at least for a while. What does peace look like when it's enforced by horse archers, not the kind of peace that sings in cathedral choirs or lives in philosophy books, but a peace of motion, a quiet that came not from harmony, but from certainty. Certainty that if you robbed a merchant, you would be hunted down across 2 continents and made an example of. This was not peace by treaty. This was peace by warning, and somehow it worked. Historians call it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. A strange and eerie term for a time when war had paved the highways. But from the middle of the 13th century to the end of the 1200s, something unusual happened across the vast stretch of the Silk Road. For the first time in memory, a single system, brutal, efficient and consistent, governed the route from China to the Mediterranean. It wasn't gentle, but it was navigable, and trade surged like blood through reopened arteries. This did not happen overnight. For centuries before the Mongol Empire, the Silk Road had flickered in and out of use. Political instability, local wars, raiding parties, collapsing kingdoms, they had all made transcontinental trade more of a gamble than a business model. Merchants could not predict who would control a mountain pass next month. Caravans could be taxed 3 or 4 times in a single desert. In some places, safety depended more on bribes than laws. The road was real, but fragmented, and it did not feel safe. Then came the horsemen. By the early 1240s, much of Central Asia, northern China, and the former Khwarezmian territories had been absorbed into the Mongol world. With each conquered region, the empire inherited infrastructure, roads, bridges, relay stations, but more importantly it inherited problems, local thugs, bandits, petty warlords, the kind of disorder that chokes trade and erodes trust. The Mongols dealt with it in a way few empires had before. They eradicated it. To understand how, you have to understand Mongol logistics. This was not just a warrior society. It was a relay machine. The Yam postal system, established and expanded under Genghis Khan in the 1230s, created an empire-wide web of supply points, messengers and rest stations. Mounted couriers could travel hundreds of kilometres in a day, changing horses at regular intervals. Information moved faster than ever before, and when the empire decided to make trade routes safe, it did not send petitions. It sent men with bows. One of the most important outcomes of this security was the reanimation of the Silk Road. Goods moved in volume not seen since the Han or Roman periods. Chinese silks, porcelain and tea flowed west. Persian glassware, carpets and medicines travelled east. Indian spices, Southeast Asian woods, Byzantine jewellery, Mongolian felt, Russian furs, Arabic manuscripts. The flow was astonishing, and not just in quantity. It was multi-directional, and it created hybrid worlds. One of the strangest beneficiaries of this peace was knowledge. With trade came scholars, translators, engineers, and doctors. Papermaking techniques spread from China to the Middle East. Islamic astronomy found its way into Mongol courts. Chinese siege engineers showed their craft to Persians. Persian miniature painters influenced Buddhist art. And in a strange twist of global irony, the very same roads that carried scientific manuscripts also carried disease, because peace doesn't stop germs. In the late 1240s, as Mongol trade links expanded into Crimea and across the Black Sea, the routes became conduits not only for goods and culture, but for the most devastating pandemic in recorded history. The plague, later called the Black Death, would erupt in Europe in the following century, but its microbial journey likely began along these arteries of enforced stability. Mongol troops, merchants and animals moved with an efficiency that the Yersinia pestis bacterium was only too happy to exploit. The same system that secured trade unwittingly globalized death, but even that cannot erase the infrastructure miracle of this era. The Mongols did not simply allow trade, they engineered for it. Bridges were repaired or rebuilt, way stations provided shelter and food, taxes were standardized, often reduced, and in many cases foreign merchants were granted protected status under imperial guarantee. Those who were harmed, robbed, defrauded, attacked, could appeal to Mongol authorities, and those authorities were known to act swiftly, even violently, to punish violators. The logic was clear. Kill one bandit in public and 100 will disappear from the road. And it wasn't just overland. Maritime trade also flourished under Mongol auspices. In the east, the ports of southern China opened more fully to Persian and Arab merchants. In the west, Genoese and Venetian traders began to arrive at the Black Sea, looking for grain, silks, and the chance to sell glass and luxury goods. The Mongols, pragmatic as always, welcomed them. Gold flowed. So did language. It is during this time that translators and interpreters became some of the most valuable figures in Mongol courts, not just linguistically, but diplomatically. And with diplomacy came ideas. Marco Polo's journey, whether fully accurate or not, takes place in this climate. So does the work of Rabban Barsauma, a Nestorian Christian from China who travelled to the Pope and back. These were not isolated wanderers. They were part of a moment in history when Eurasia felt, if not unified, then at least threaded together by a common sense of navigability. That feeling would not last. But for a few decades, it was real. What's fascinating is that this peace, while brutally enforced, was strangely impersonal. The Mongols did not favour a single culture or creed. They did not impose their gods or their clothes or their language. Instead, they imposed a system of roads, of laws, of fear, and of permission. You could be anyone from anywhere if you followed the rules. That alone made the system different from many empires before and after it. But it also made it fragile, because the peace of fear only lasts as long as the fear, and fear, like empires, fades. By the late 1290s, signs of fraying had already begun. The empire had fractured into khanates. Local governors began to prioritise their own interests. Tribute systems became more exploitative. Trade continued, but not always under the same guarantees. The vast reach of the Mongol world became harder to administer, and the once stable arteries began to clog with uncertainty. The Pax Mongolica had not ended, but it was no longer universal, and yet its memory lingered. In European maps, Mongol names appeared with respect. In Persian chronicles, the trade networks of the 13th century were remembered as golden years. In Chinese records, the Mongol peace was both resented and acknowledged. And across the former empire, roads still existed. Ways to move goods and people. Ways to think about the world not as a patchwork of barriers, but as a single traversable terrain. So maybe peace, in this case, was not serenity. It was predictability. You knew where the danger was, you knew who controlled it, and you knew what it would cost to stay safe. Not moral peace, but practical peace. Which leaves a final, unsettling question. Was that enough? If the Silk Road could only truly function under the threat of mounted violence, does that mean it was never really peaceful at all? Or is there something else to be learned here? Something about the power of systems, the strange shape of trust, and the reality that sometimes history's quietest moments are enforced by the loudest forces. The answer, like the road itself, is winding, but the fact remains. For one strange moment in human history, an empire of riders brought order to chaos, not by healing the world, but by holding it firmly in place, and for better or worse, the caravans moved. How did a sky-worshipping empire become a Buddhist power? And how did a people once dismissed as godless by their neighbours come to host more faiths within their camps than most medieval cities held in their walls? The Mongol Empire was not just a conquest machine, it was a spiritual sieve, one that let belief systems pass through it, filter into it, and sometimes rearrange themselves entirely. This wasn't multiculturalism as an ideology, it was something more practical, more anthropological, a kind of imperial flexibility rooted in survival, horseback mobility, and a worldview shaped by clouds, wind, and flame. Before Buddhism, before mosques, before the missionaries from the west and the monks from the east, there was Tengri. Tengri, in the most ancient steppe traditions, was the eternal sky. Not a bearded man with opinions, not a god with rules. Tengri was the open blue itself, unreachable, unknowable, and above all. The world was beneath him, or perhaps within him, and his favour was not promised, only earned. Mongol rulers did not speak to Tengri so much as try to walk in alignment with him. Victories in battle, a good harvest, a successful migration. These were signs that the sky had not turned away. This sky-centred cosmology is known today as Tengrism, though that label is modern. In practice, the belief system blended seamlessly with animism, ancestral veneration, and shamanic ritual. Spirits were thought to dwell in rivers, trees, mountains, and even the bones of animals. The world was not inert, it was inhabited. And among the steppe dwellers, a special class of ritual specialists, shamans, mediated between the seen and the unseen. Shamans could be male or female. They wore robes trimmed with animal parts, carried drums or bells, and entered trance states to heal, guide, or predict. Their presence was not fringe, it was central. Before a raid, a shaman might divine the outcome. Before a journey, they might bless the horses. Their tools, carved antlers, eagle feathers, talismans of horn and iron, reflected a belief system where the physical and spiritual had no sharp border. Nature was not separate from the divine. It was the medium through which the divine moved. So what happens when a culture like this collides with the world's great religions? In most empires you'd expect suppression, standardization, or at least a slow conversion campaign. But the Mongols took a different path. As they expanded westward into the Islamic world, and eastward into Buddhist China, they encountered the full mosaic of human spirituality. Sunni Islam, Orthodox Christianity, Mahayana Buddhism, Taoism, Nestorian Christianity, Zoroastrianism, Judaism. And rather than erase them, they often preserved them, or at least permitted them. Part of this came from pragmatism. The Mongols were empire builders, but they were not cultural chauvinists. They did not arrive with a civilizing mission. They arrived with an army, a tax expectation, and a basic rule: obey the Khan and keep your gods if you like. In many Mongol cities, churches stood beside mosques. Buddhist temples shared neighbourhoods with Confucian halls. Pagan rituals coexisted with Islamic madrasas. Religious figures were not only tolerated, they were sometimes placed under imperial protection. The rationale wasn't philosophical, it was strategic. By protecting clerics, the Mongols secured loyalty. By exempting them from taxes, a policy often extended to monks, priests and scholars, they gained political favour without incurring military cost. In effect, religion was treated like any other regional system of knowledge. Useful, containable, worth preserving so long as it didn't challenge the throne. Still, this tolerance wasn't uniform. In periods of political crisis, certain groups did face persecution. Taoist texts were burned under some Khans. Christian privileges were revoked in others. At one point, Muslim ritual slaughter and circumcision were banned. But these moments were inconsistencies within a broader pattern of pluralism. The empire, at its height, had no single state religion. Instead, it had a state goal, obedience, and religion was judged by how well it supported or undermined that. Over time, though, some conversions did occur. By the late 1300s, several Mongol rulers had embraced Buddhism, particularly Tibetan forms, as a state philosophy. This was not a simple spiritual shift. Tibetan Buddhism, with its complex rituals, reincarnated lamas and hierarchical structures, offered something the steppe belief system lacked: a sophisticated ideological framework for governance. It provided moral narratives, divine legitimacy, and a priestly class that could bless a ruler's mandate without threatening it. In many ways, Buddhism did for the Mongol courts what Confucianism did for Chinese dynasties. It helped dress power in cosmic robes. But this did not erase Tengrism. The sky never left. Even among Buddhist Mongols, the name Tengri continued to appear in prayers, inscriptions, and royal seals. The eternal blue sky remained a kind of ambient divinity, above and behind all other beliefs, a reminder that before temples and doctrines there had been wind, hoofbeats, and stars. Christianity too left a subtle mark. Nestorian Christians had been present in Central Asia long before the Mongol expansion. Some Mongol queens, including the famous Sorghaghtani Beki, mother of Kublai Khan, were Christian, and for a time it looked as if the Mongols might become a Christian empire. European powers certainly hoped so. Papal envoys were sent. Crusade alliances were proposed, but the religious fluidity of the Mongols made such expectations naive. They could host Mass in the morning and a Buddhist ritual in the afternoon. They were not monotheistic in the exclusivist sense. They were accumulators of sacredness. Even Islam, though it later became dominant in certain khanates, entered the Mongol world more through diplomacy and intermarriage than conquest. By the time of the Ilkhanate in Persia, several rulers had adopted Islam, and Islamic scholars and jurists played prominent roles in administration. But again, this was not a break with the past so much as an adaptation. Mongol spirituality was always evolving. It had room for mosques, just as it had once had room for deer bones and sky drums. So what does this tell us about the spiritual DNA of the Mongol world? It tells us that belief can be mobile, that empires don't always spread religion like a stamp, but sometimes like a sponge, absorbing, merging, letting faiths coexist without being resolved. The Mongol Empire was not spiritually coherent in the way European kingdoms or Islamic caliphates often were. It was plural, practical, and in many ways unresolved. And perhaps that was its strength, because in a world where most powers demanded ideological conformity, the Mongols offered something else: space. A violent, conditional, often terrifying kind of space, but space nonetheless. Room for Christian monks to argue with Taoist sages, room for Muslim astronomers to work under Buddhist patrons, room for shamans to chant beside temples built by foreign artisans. Of course, it couldn't last. Pluralism is fragile. As the empire fractured and successor states formed, religious factions gained more political power, tolerance narrowed, rules hardened. But for a time, a strange breathless time, the empire of the steppe worshipped no single god, yet hosted nearly all of them. So the question lingers: was this tolerance belief? Or was it strategy masquerading as faith? Did the Mongols believe in gods? Or did they believe in belief itself, as a kind of tool, a diplomatic lubricant, a way to calm the empires they ruled? We cannot ask them, but we can read their inscriptions, their temple grants, their legal codes, and we can try, humbly, quietly, to piece together what it meant to rule under a sky god while sponsoring lamas and protecting mullahs. Because in the end, the empire did not offer spiritual answers, it offered spiritual latitude, and that, in a world of absolutes, may have been the most heretical belief of all. There are many ways to find a ghost. You can look for bones, you can search for whispers in scrolls or tombs or ruins left half buried in dust. Or, if you happen to be a modern human in the early 21st century, you can take a cotton swab, rub it gently along the inside of your cheek, and hand it to a laboratory technician. In the year 2003, a team of geneticists led by Dr. Tatiana Zajal published a study in the journal American Journal of Human Genetics that made global headlines almost immediately. It was, on the surface, a fairly technical paper, dense with Y chromosome markers, microsatellite repeats, haplogroup notations, and cautious statistical modelling. But hidden in its final pages was a quiet little phrase that would ignite imaginations worldwide. The authors suggested that a particular male lineage, found in a large proportion of men living in a band stretching from northeast China to Central Asia, may have originated with a single prolific ancestor who lived in Mongolia sometime around the 13th century. And if that sounds oddly specific, well, it was. The study didn't say his name, but everyone else did. The media called it the Genghis Khan gene, and science, which normally moves through the world with a kind of careful, doubting slowness, suddenly found itself speeding through headlines like a Mongol cavalry column. To understand why this theory was so compelling, we have to pause, not in a battlefield or a throne room, but in a spreadsheet. The research team had been collecting Y chromosome data from more than 2,000 men across Central Asia. Y chromosomes, unlike most of the human genome, are passed almost unchanged from father to son. They don't recombine with their maternal counterparts like most of our DNA does. They are, in a sense, a patrilineal fingerprint. Mutations happen slowly, over generations, and certain mutations, microsatellite markers, SNPs, can be grouped together into what geneticists call haplotypes. Some haplotypes are extremely common across populations, some are very rare, and then, very occasionally, one shows up that is both widespread and tightly clustered in ancestry, suggesting a relatively recent and rapid expansion. That's what the researchers found. A particular Y chromosome lineage, identified by its marker STR patterns, appeared in about 8% of men across a swath of territory from northeast China to Uzbekistan. That's roughly 16 million living men at the time of the study, all with a nearly identical Y chromosome, all presumably descending from the same man, or at least the same patrilineal line. Now, this kind of genetic clustering is not by itself that unusual. All modern Y chromosomes, after all, come from a shared common ancestor, known informally as Y chromosomal Adam, who lived somewhere in Africa more than 200,000 years ago. But such ancient lineages diversify over time. What made this one striking was how young it appeared to be. Using molecular clock estimates, the researchers dated its origin to about 800 years ago, which, if you're counting backward from the year 2003, takes you to the early 13th century, and that, as every Mongolian schoolchild knows, is exactly when Genghis Khan was alive. The timing fit, the geography fit, and the cultural context was plausible. Genghis Khan had dozens of wives and concubines. His sons ruled vast territories and had many children of their own, and under Mongol imperial customs, male descendants were often privileged in leadership, inheritance, and prestige. If you were born into the Borjigin clan and claimed descent from the Great Khan, you were more than just a noble, you were part of a living legend. That legacy may have been biological as well as political. So the study floated a suggestion. Perhaps this clustered lineage was the genetic echo of an imperial dynasty. Perhaps the reason so many men across Eurasia shared the same Y chromosome was because their ancestor wasn't just a man. He was the man who carved an empire out of the horsebone and fire. The theory had all the ingredients of a viral myth. It was scientifically grounded, but just vague enough to inspire speculation. It flattered our appetite for origin stories. It blurred the line between historical legend and molecular biology. And it offered a kind of strange comfort that even in the age of computers and satellites and gene sequencers, we were still somehow riding the wake of a man who once drank fermented mare's milk and watched stars rise over the Mongolian plain. That maybe, just maybe, he was still inside us. But if you've spent time in the company of geneticists, you'll know they're not much for legends. And if you read the study closely, you'll notice how carefully the authors hedge their claims. They never state that the lineage is from Genghis Khan. They merely note that its timing and geographic distribution make him a plausible candidate. The term star cluster they used wasn't a poetic flourish. It was a technical term, referring to a pattern of similar haplotypes, branching rapidly from a central point in a phylogenetic tree. It looks like a starburst, and it suggests a demographic phenomenon, a burst of male line descendants from a single successful male ancestor. That's all it means. The rest is interpretation, and that's where the myth-making begins. Popular coverage quickly shed the caveats. Headlines declared that Genghis Khan had 16 million descendants. Documentaries followed. So did textbooks. It became a kind of factoid, half science, half folklore, that filtered into public consciousness. But the further it spread, the further it drifted from the data. Because the truth is, we don't know who that man was. He may have been Genghis Khan, or he may have been an obscure tribal leader whose lineage, for reasons of luck or strategy or sheer survival, managed to dominate a particular region's male population. Or it could be that the lineage emerged not from one man, but from a small group of related males, brothers, cousins, whose collective descendants carried the signal forward. There's also a deeper issue, one that speaks to how we interpret genetic information in historical contexts. Genes don't carry names. DNA doesn't come with a birth certificate. All it tells us is similarity, ancestry, mutation rate, and probability. To connect a living genetic cluster to a specific historical figure, we need something more. Either a confirmed biological sample from the individual in question, or overwhelming cultural and genealogical evidence that ties the cluster to a known descendant line. In the case of Genghis Khan, we have neither. His tomb has never been found, his bones have never been tested. And while some Borjigin lineages have been traced genealogically, they do not necessarily all share this Y chromosome cluster. In fact, later studies have identified multiple lineages among Mongol noble descendants, suggesting either polylyny, adoption, or dynastic complexity. There's also a thorny statistical wrinkle. If you go far enough back, almost everyone alive today shares ancestry with almost everyone else. Geneticist Adam Rutherford once noted that Genghis Khan is likely an ancestor of the vast majority of people alive today, simply due to pedigree collapse and ancestral interbreeding. But that's not what this cluster is about. It's about a direct paternal line, father to son to son to son. And that's a very narrow slice of ancestry. It tells us nothing about mothers, daughters, or horizontal kinship. So what are we left with? We're left with a beautifully suggestive pattern in the Y chromosome data. A star cluster, a burst, a demographic signal of male reproductive success in a specific region and time, and a name that hovers above it, not confirmed, not denied, just whispered, like a horse hoof on dry steppe grass, and maybe that's enough. Not proof, but possibility. A scientific observation wrapped in humility. An echo, not a voice. A reminder that the past does not yield its secrets easily, and that even in the age of genetics the dead are still allowed to keep some of their mysteries. And as for the man himself, whoever he was, his legacy may be less about how many children he had, and more about how we keep trying to find him, even in our own blood. It began with a promise, a single genetic signature, traced through the Y chromosomes of millions of men across Asia, whispered of an ancestral explosion, a lineage expanding so quickly, so forcefully, that it almost begged for a name. And in the early 2000s, many gave it one, Genghis Khan, the star cluster, the genetic echo of empire. But over the next decade, something quiet happened, the kind of quiet only science can generate. More data arrived, more samples were tested, and that early elegant story began to crack. Let's rewind the microscope, just a little. When the original star cluster hypothesis was proposed in the early 2000s, the global genetic record was still in its early adolescence. The study, published by Zeryal and colleagues in the year 2003, had looked at Y chromosome microsatellites, short tandem repeats on the male line, across over 2,000 men in Central and East Asia. What they found was striking. About 8% of the sampled men, from a wide arc across the former Mongol Empire, shared a particular Y chromosome lineage within haplogroup C. Its defining feature wasn't just its frequency, but its internal structure, low diversity, suggesting a single explosive origin not too many centuries ago. In other words, a powerful founder effect, but scientific elegance is not the same as historical certainty. That original paper was cautious in its conclusions. The authors proposed Genghis Khan as a plausible source for the cluster, citing the historical record of Mongol male line dominance, polygyny, and imperial expansion. They did not claim proof, but the idea was sticky. It travelled fast. And suddenly, a lot of people who had never read a population genetics paper were talking about medieval sperm. Over the next decade, genetic sampling across Asia expanded rapidly. Whole genome sequencing became cheaper. More Y SNPs, stable markers on the Y chromosome, were discovered and catalogued, and by the 2010s researchers had access to datasets far larger and more diverse than anything available in 2003. This was when the original story started to wobble. One of the most important reassessments came from a large-scale study published in the year 2015 by Balaresk, Jobling and collaborators. This study examined over 5,300 Y chromosomes from 127 populations across Asia. Their goal was to identify other cases of likely male line reproductive success, other star clusters, like the one originally associated with Genghis, and they found them. 11 such lineages, in fact. Some were clearly unrelated to the Mongols. Some emerged in sedentary agriculturalist regions, not on the steppe. And crucially, the so-called Genghis cluster was just one of many. It no longer stood alone. Another blow came from inside China. Chinese teams with access to dense regional Y chromosome data began to reassess the structure of haplogroup C and its subbranches. In a study published in the year 2018, researchers sequenced hundreds of full Y chromosomes across East Asia, breaking down the clade structure far more precisely than had been possible before, and what they found did not support a single explosive origin tied neatly to the 13th century. Instead, the haplotype once thought to be Genghis appeared as part of a broader, more complex tree, a tree with branches diverging long before and long after his lifetime. Its geographic spread also didn't match perfectly with Mongol imperial boundaries. There were areas of high frequency where Mongol influence had been weak, and areas of low frequency and former Mongol strongholds. The signal was not consistent, but perhaps the most sobering finding was statistical. The original idea had relied on the concept of variance. If a male line haplotype is very common but shows little internal diversity, that usually suggests a rapid expansion from a recent common ancestor. But the new studies showed that other lineages had very similar variance patterns, and that many could be explained without invoking famous rulers or dynasties. In other words, the star cluster wasn't genetically special. It was culturally interesting, and that's a problem for interpretation. The challenge, as always in historical genetics, is one of resolution. The deeper we peer into the genome, the more we must confront the limits of our certainty. No study to date has directly sampled the DNA of Genghis Khan himself. His tomb remains undiscovered, his body unrecovered. We have no confirmed genetic material from any of his known sons, and even if we did, proving continuity between those samples and modern haplotypes would require a level of precision that current population-level Y chromosome data simply cannot guarantee. Lineages mutate. Populations shift. Polygyny, adoption, and cultural inheritance complicate everything. There's another quiet problem: time depth. Even with modern SNP-based techniques, dating a Y chromosome lineage's expansion is not exact. Different mutation rate models can produce different age estimates, and while the original star cluster was dated to roughly 800 years ago, conveniently matching Genghis's era, newer analyses have suggested it could be older or younger or even composite. In other words, not a single expansion but several overlapping ones now blurred together. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a question more honest than most headlines can tolerate. Did Genghis Khan leave a genetic legacy? Almost certainly. He had many wives, many children, and a political system that rewarded male line descent. But did he leave a specific Y chromosome lineage that we can point to, test for, and trace across Asia, like a ghost on horseback? That answer, for now, is no. That doesn't make the story weaker, it makes it real. The scientific method is not a myth-making machine, it is a slow erosion of error, a way to get less wrong over time. The original star cluster story was a bold hypothesis, built on the best data available at the time. But science moves forward not by confirming what we wish were true, but by confronting what the data actually say. And in this case, the data say, not so fast. We cannot genetically canonize a Khan based on a correlation. We cannot transform a haplotype into a man without evidence, and that perhaps is the real lesson here. Even in the age of genomes, some graves remain closed, some names remain unsampled, and some myths are more useful when left as questions. So the star cluster fades, not because it was false, but because it was incomplete. And that's exactly how science should work. It begins with a signal, it sharpens with data, and if we're lucky, it ends not in certainty, but in humility. And if you happen to be listening to this while drifting off, the story continues in the next chapter. Check the timestamps in the description if you want to pick up where you left off tomorrow. It's all connected. Every fragment, every false lead, every quiet correction. We still don't know whose genes we're following, but we're closer than we were, and that's something. What if it wasn't one man? What if the genetic echoes we trace today were never the aftermath of a single warlord, but the overlapping legacies of hundreds of powerful lineages? For all the mythic gravity assigned to one Y chromosome cluster in the early 2000s, and for all the imaginations fired by the idea of Genghis Khan reshaping the genetic map of Asia, the truth, as always, is more intricate, less cinematic, but infinitely more human. It turns out the phenomenon once associated with a lone Mongol emperor might actually be part of a broader, older, and much less personalised pattern, one where the axis of male reproductive success swings not on charisma or conquest alone, but on mobility, politics, and the quiet logistics of power. This idea was formalised in a study published in the year 2015 in the European Journal of Human Genetics. The authors, including Patricia Ballaresque and Mark Jobling, had a simple question. Was the so-called Genghis Khan effect, the dramatic spread of a Y chromosome lineage over an enormous swath of Asia, a one-off anomaly or part of a repeating pattern? To find out, they didn't just re-examine the supposed Mongol markers, they broadened the search entirely. Over 5,000 Y chromosomes from 127 populations across Asia were studied. The researchers were not looking for any specific known individual or dynasty. Instead, they were scanning the data set for clusters, statistically distinct groupings of high-frequency Y chromosome haplotypes, all embedded within the same haplogroup that suggested a shared patrilineal ancestor had, at some point in the past, enjoyed exceptional reproductive success. In plain terms, they were looking for genetic footprints left by men who had more sons than everyone else, sons who kept having sons, and sons who stayed in the same general region long enough to make the pattern visible 1,000 years later. What they found was striking. 11 separate descent clusters emerged from the data, 11 lineages that showed evidence of male reproductive dominance over time. And while 2 of those clusters matched earlier findings associated with Mongol and Manchu elite lineages, including the famous, if increasingly uncertain, Genghis-associated cluster, the rest were spread across geography and chronology. These were not isolated incidents. They were a structural pattern. Most of the clusters could be dated to expansions between the early 2nd millennium BCE and the 12th century CE, a timeline that stretched well beyond the Mongol period. Some originated among sedentary agricultural societies, others arose from nomadic pastoralist contexts. Yet a curious trend did emerge. The more recent the cluster, the more likely it was to originate in Altaic-speaking steppe-based populations, and the more tightly linked it was to mobile, militarized, male-dominated political structures, the kind of societies where power and reproduction were sometimes inseparable. This is where the story becomes more than just genetics. These descent clusters are not evenly distributed. They are overwhelmingly concentrated in societies that practice polygyny among elites, that used horses to project military power over vast distances, and that tied political legitimacy to lineage claims, often mythic, sometimes divine. In these contexts, a victorious leader might not just conquer a city. He might install his sons as governors, take dozens of wives or concubines, and integrate defeated elites through marriage or coercion. And unlike in many sedentary societies, where inheritance patterns might be diluted by local land rights or rival bureaucracies, steppe empires had little institutional resistance to the reproductive dominance of their khans. It's important to pause here and resist the narrative trap. These were not genetic empires. No one set out to spread their Y chromosome as a biological goal. What we're seeing instead is a demographic echo, the residual pattern left behind when political systems reward elite males with expanded reproductive access, and when those patterns repeat across time and region. In the language of genetics, this is called a star-like phylogeny, where one lineage radiates outward rapidly, accumulating few mutations early on, because it spreads quickly and widely in a short evolutionary window. The Mongol Empire was not unique in producing such a pattern, but it was, to date, one of the largest and best documented. Other descent clusters in the Balaresk study have been tentatively linked to various Turkic or Manchu lineages, though the connections are speculative and the identities remain largely unknown. In fact, that's the point. Most of these clusters are invisible in the historical record. We don't have names, we don't have tombs, we have only frequencies, mathematical ghosts flickering through our models of population spread. This is humbling. For every Genghis Khan whose legend lingers, there are dozens of forgotten patriarchs whose genes echo in millions without a story. It reminds us that history as written is always partial. The past we narrate is skewed by literacy, record-keeping and cultural bias. But the past etched into our DNA tells a more chaotic tale, one where empires rise and fall and only the demographic patterns remain. A particularly interesting observation in the Balaresk study is the alignment of these clusters with specific cultural practices. Societies that allowed or encouraged elite polygyny showed stronger descent clusters. So did those that tied military success directly to political legitimacy. In some cases, the adoption of pastoralism itself, with its inherent mobility and clan-based structure, may have facilitated more uneven reproductive success among men than agriculture did. While farmers passed land to sons, horse lords sometimes passed territories. This helps explain why some of the largest Y chromosome clusters arise not from massive urban civilizations, but from decentralized steppe societies. It wasn't the density of cities that mattered, it was the mobility of armies, the ability to ride, raid and reproduce without being tied down to a single administrative system. In such systems, social mobility could be genetically consequential. A man who rose through battle could father a lineage, and that lineage, if it remained politically dominant, could reshape the genetic landscape of a region over centuries. And yet, there's caution in these interpretations. As the authors of the study themselves note, genetics can only tell us so much. We can model frequency, we can infer age, we can hypothesize about selection, drift or cultural practices, but we cannot assign names to clusters without independent evidence. This is where science must resist the temptation of story. Most descent clusters will remain anonymous. Most influential ancestors are unknown. And that, perhaps, is the most scientifically honest thing we can say. The pattern is clear. The details are not. We know that elite male reproductive success shaped the Y chromosome landscape of Asia. We know it happened multiple times in multiple places over millennia. But we don't know who most of these men were. Their palaces are gone, their kingdoms erased, their names unrecorded. What we have is the echo, a silent signal moving forward through time, shaped by power, preserved by inheritance, and finally discovered by humans asking questions in sterile laboratories centuries later. So perhaps the real myth is not just that one man changed the world. The real myth is that we ever needed his name. What happens to DNA when you conquer half of everything? You don't just take territory. You don't just build roads or change who collects the taxes. You move people. You scatter them, resettle them, enslave them, marry them, exile them, trade them, and sometimes erase them. But you also link them, not intentionally, not as a policy, but through the steady, accumulative side effects of empire. And the Mongol Empire, more than most, left its fingerprints not only in language, law or memory, but in the very biology of Eurasia. Between the early 13th century and the late 14th century, the Mongol world system covered more contiguous territory than any empire in history. From Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf, it stitched together peoples who, only decades before, had never heard of each other. And for nearly a century those connections held. Goods flowed, horses galloped, caravans moved, and genes, quietly and invisibly, went with them. This is not the story of one man's lineage. Not anymore. The era of the Mongol Empire reshaped population structure on a continental scale, and not just because of conquest. The great surprise is how much of this gene flow came not from slaughter, but from infrastructure, from road systems and security protocols, from relay stations and diplomatic convoys, from the enforced peace of Pax Mongolica, which made it possible, for the first time in centuries, to travel overland across the spine of Asia and survive. One of the most revealing findings in modern population genetics is the extraordinary admixture found in Central Eurasia. Studies conducted in the 21st century, using broad-scale autosomal sampling, consistently show that Central Asian populations have more diverse ancestral components than almost anywhere else. We see contributions from Western Europe, the Middle East, South Asia, East Asia, and even signals traceable to Arctic and subarctic peoples of the far north. This is not just modern noise, it is the imprint of centuries of movement, much of which intensified during the Mongol era, because the empire did not simply conquer, it absorbed. The Mongol strategy of governance was eclectic and ruthlessly pragmatic. After conquests, they often spared skilled labourers, deporting them thousands of kilometres to build or repair infrastructure. Artisans from China were relocated to Central Asia. Engineers from Persia were brought to build siege engines in the east. Administrators from the Islamic world were appointed to help govern new territories. These were not isolated incidents, they were patterns, and each relocation mixed gene pools just a little more. The Silk Road had existed long before Genghis Khan, but under Mongol rule its security and efficiency reached a new peak. Armed caravans could cross from the Yellow River to the Mediterranean with the protection of a single legal and logistical system. Alongside silk and spices, people moved. So did marriages, voluntary and forced. So did military conscripts, children of hostages, translators, couriers and wandering monks. In the shadows of empire, intimacy flourished, sometimes gently, often violently, but always consequentially. One key feature of this gene flow is that it was not one-directional. This was not a wave of Mongol DNA overwhelming the West. It was a tangle. Admixture went in every direction. You can find Chinese ancestry in parts of Iran. Persian genetic signatures show up in Western Mongolia. Turkic and Indo-European components appear throughout the steppe. Even populations in the Caucasus show increased East Asian genetic affinity during this period. Central Asia did not belong to any one group. It became a blender. This helps explain a curious paradox. For all the violence associated with the Mongol conquests, the long-term genetic legacy is not one of homogeneity or domination. It is one of complexity. The empire dissolved. Its languages faded. Its ruling elite were absorbed or overthrown. But in the chromosomes of the region's descendants, the story didn't end. It diffused. Interestingly, even the descendants of former Mongol subjects carry faint traces of this era. Some of the gene flow detected in southeastern Europe and parts of Russia may trace back to the movements of Mongol armies and administrative settlements. In South Asia, too, small genetic components associated with East Asian ancestry may correspond to Central Asian incursions during or after the Mongol period. None of these are massive replacements. They are subtle overlays, ghosts of caravans, whispers of displacement. And it wasn't only humans who moved. The Mongol world system also facilitated the transfer of microbiota, of domesticated animals and their parasites, of crops and their pollinators. While this drifts outside the focus of human genetics, it speaks to the wider biological entanglements that the empire catalyzed. Every movement carried biological payloads, not just soldiers and merchants, but their ecosystems. It is tempting to ask whether we can isolate a Mongol genetic signature today. But the reality is more diffuse. There is no clear boundary, no single marker. And that may be the most revealing truth of all. Empire does not leave crisp genetic flags. It leaves gradients, mixed signals, statistical tilts that only make sense when seen at scale, and even then the resolution is foggy. Still, the data do show something important. The Mongol Empire amplified existing corridors of gene flow. It widened them, hardened them into infrastructure, and for a brief window in medieval history it accelerated human mobility in ways that no prior regime had ever done across so vast a space. That mobility, even more than conquest, is what shaped the genome of Eurasia, so if you're looking for the empire's biological legacy, Don't look for one man's name. Look at the blurred edges, the places where East and West bleed into each other, where a village in Kazakhstan carries alleles from India and a town in Uzbekistan shows ancestry from the Yellow River Basin. Look not for dominance, but diffusion. The mark of empire, not as a sword, but as a corridor, and then ask, when you conquer half the world, what survives? Borders collapse, languages vanish, but the body remembers, quietly, through inheritance. How can we prove you share DNA with a stranger in Kazakhstan? Not because you look alike, not because your ancestors carried flags or crossed paths on horseback, but because, buried deep within your genome, there are quiet stretches of code, hundreds of thousands of them, that don't just echo the same general pattern as other humans, but match exactly, down to the letter. And those identical stretches, inherited from a shared ancestor, tell us something very simple. You are, whether you know it or not, related. This is the science of identical by descent, or IBD. It has nothing to do with royal bloodlines, and everything to do with fragment lengths, recombination rates, and statistical inference. If that doesn't sound poetic, you're right, but the story it helps us tell might be the closest thing we have to a time machine. Because unlike myth, IBD has a half-life. The longer ago your shared ancestor lived, the smaller the shared fragment becomes. Like torn-up pages from the same lost book, each segment gets shorter with every generation that passes, a silent countdown encoded into the fabric of your body. To understand IBD, we need to briefly step back into the broader field of population genetics. Every human carries 2 copies of each chromosome, one from the mother, one from the father, except for the sex chromosomes, where the system works a bit differently. Over time, these chromosomes are shuffled through a process called recombination. During the creation of sperm and egg cells, the chromosomes from each parent swap chunks with each other. That means your genome is not a clean split of mom and dad, but a mosaic, a genetic collage shaped by generations of inheritance. When 2 people share an IBD segment, it means that small section of DNA was passed down to them from a common ancestor without being broken apart by recombination. And that's a big deal, because recombination is relentless. The longer ago that ancestor lived, the more likely the segment has been chipped away, trimmed by genetic reshuffling. Eventually it disappears, but for a few hundred years, sometimes a few thousand depending on population structure, these fragments can persist, not just as general similarity, but as literal identity. The same alleles, in the same order, sitting quietly in 2 otherwise disconnected bodies. The size of the fragment helps us estimate how long ago the shared ancestor lived. A long, unbroken segment, recent ancestor, tiny snippet, many generations ago. When aggregated across a large population, these patterns allow geneticists to reconstruct past demographic events, bottlenecks, expansions, migrations, and yes, the blurred footprints of conquest. This brings us to the global context. In recent years, studies using IBD methods have transformed our understanding of human connectivity. For example, one analysis comparing individuals across Eurasia revealed that many populations who speak different languages, follow different religions, and live thousands of kilometers apart still carry overlapping IBD segments. That is, they share silent genetic echoes of people who lived centuries ago and left descendants in multiple directions. Often, these echoes cross modern borders. Kazakhs and Hungarians, Persians and Chinese, Tibetans and Siberians. These are not random pairings. They reflect the great movements of history: trade, war, slavery, exile, marriage, diplomacy. IBD is especially helpful in regions like Central Asia, where history was often written not in documents, but in dispersal. Written records are rare, tombs are lost, oral history fades, but genetic fragments remain. And by comparing them, not as raw genomes but as shared inheritance, we gain a new kind of map, one drawn not by conquerors or scholars, but by the quiet arithmetic of meiosis. It is important, though, to temper expectations. IBD is not a magic key. It cannot tell us who your ancestors were, what language they spoke, or how they felt about their neighbours. It is a probability engine, a statistical framework. Its resolution fades quickly, especially beyond 10 or 20 generations, and crucially, it can only detect shared ancestry that left surviving descendants. If your lineage vanished, whether by disease, war, or simple demographic drift, it leaves no IBD trace. Genetic silence is not evidence of absence, but of loss. Still, the methodology is growing sharper. New computational techniques allow researchers to scan thousands of genomes for shared segments. Algorithms compare haplotypes, adjust for population structure, and estimate coalescent times, the moment when two lineages last shared a common node in their ancestry tree. The more samples we have, the clearer the picture becomes. And with biobanks growing across continents, that picture is now global. There is, however, one more twist. Sometimes, the segments you share with others are not from just one ancestor. They might be compound traces, overlapping fragments from multiple people in your lineage who happen to share the same segment from yet another shared ancestor. The further back you go, the messier it gets. This is why IBD studies are probabilistic. They speak in ranges, not certainties, and they must always be interpreted with humility. Which brings us back to that stranger in Kazakhstan. If you do share a segment with them, let's say a block on chromosome 15 that matches for 10 centimorgans, then somewhere, perhaps 20 or 30 generations back, you shared a person. Not a myth, not a name, just a person. Someone who passed down a small identical fragment to two descendants who now live in different countries, speak different languages, and probably never imagined they were related. But in a very literal sense, they are, and that's the beauty of this field. It doesn't flatter us. It doesn't tell us we are kings or heroes. It simply shows, over and over, that we are not alone. That however divided our histories have become, our bodies still whisper about the times we were one, and sometimes that whisper survives. Not as a story, but as code. Where do we look if we want to test the Empire's shadow? If you're holding a 21st century cheek swab and wondering whether the Mongol Empire left a mark in your genome, you are not alone. Thousands of people across Eurasia have posed this same question, some driven by scientific curiosity, others by a quiet itch of ancestral pride or historical speculation. But the truth is, that shadow is hard to measure, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the tangled case of the Tatars. The term Tatar has changed meaning across centuries, geographies, and political regimes. Originally, it referred to one of the many steppe groups that were absorbed, conquered, or allied by the Mongols during their 13th century campaigns. Later, Tatar became a catch-all designation in Russian chronicles and European maps for almost any Turkic-speaking or Mongol-aligned population across the steppe. Over time, it hardened into a cultural and ethnic label that is still used today. But linguistically, genetically, and historically, the Tatars are not a singular thing, and that makes them both the perfect and the most frustrating population to study if your goal is to trace Mongol legacy through the body. Modern Tatars, especially the Volga Tatars, who today form the largest ethnic minority in Russia, are a genetic mosaic. The region they inhabit, centered around Tatarstan and the Volga River basin, has seen millennia of migration, conquest and resettlement. Scythians, Sarmatians, Uralic tribes, Bulgars, Khazars, Mongols, Russians and more have all passed through, left their mark, or stayed. So when a geneticist samples a modern Tatar genome, what they're holding is not a clean strand of Mongol DNA, but a centuries-thick palimpsest of overlapping historical layers. And the Mongol era, while potent and violent, was only one of them. Yet some researchers have tried. Several genetic studies in the past 2 decades have explored whether Tatar populations carry markers that might correlate with the genetic footprint of the Mongol Empire. Most do not point to a clear answer. While certain Y chromosome haplogroups associated with Central Asian steppe populations are present among Tatars, they are also present among other Turkic and Uralic-speaking groups in the region. In fact, the most common haplogroups found in Tatar males today reflect a mix of European, Siberian, and Central Asian lineages. None of them match exclusively to a known Mongol origin. One complication is the role of the Golden Horde, a western Khanate of the Mongol Empire that ruled over parts of modern-day Russia and Ukraine. The Horde's elite, often referred to in historical sources as Tatars, intermarried, settled, and eventually blended into the populations they ruled. Over time, the term Tatar expanded to include not only Mongol conquerors, but also the Turkic-speaking Islamicized populations that emerged from this fusion. The result is a genetic record that reflects not only conquest but conversion, trade, migration, and centuries of post-imperial evolution. This has sparked controversy in modern identity politics. Some Tatar activists and cultural historians embrace the Mongol legacy as a point of pride, emphasizing the historic role of their ancestors in the Golden Horde and their links to the vast Eurasian past. Others downplay the Mongol connection entirely, seeing it as an imposed narrative that erases older, pre-Mongol cultural roots. Genetic data does not resolve this debate. In fact, it complicates it. Because DNA is not loyal to clean labels, it tracks kinship and mixture, not cultural inheritance. And that means the answer to who carries Mongol DNA is never going to be tidy. Recent studies have tried to look at broader autosomal patterns, those parts of the genome not limited to the Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA. These analyses show that Tatar populations are, on average, genetically closer to neighbouring Turkic groups in Central Asia and to Slavic populations in European Russia than to any known descendants of Mongol elites. In other words, the empire's signal, if it's there, has long since been diluted. Even if Genghis Khan's warriors had children in the region, the recombination of genes over hundreds of years has scattered those fragments beyond easy identification. What we're left with is statistical tilt, not proof. A slight elevation of East Asian ancestry components here, a clustering with Central Eurasian populations there. Nothing definitive. Nothing you could point to and say, here is the Mongol inside the Tatar. Just echoes. Faint ones. The kind that need dozens of computers and thousands of samples to detect. And yet, those echoes matter. Because they show us how tangled history is when seen at the molecular level. They remind us that identity, be it Tatar, Mongol, Russian, or anything else, is a story we tell with language and memory, not chromosomes. Genes can reveal connections. They can surprise us with links we never suspected. But they cannot fix the borders of identity or adjudicate between myths. They cannot confirm whether the Mongol Empire lives on in the blood of the modern Tatars. They can only whisper that once, long ago, these worlds touched. So if you're wondering who still carries Mongol DNA, perhaps the better question is, what kind of a legacy do you want to find? The kind that comes with a percentage on a test result? Or the kind that lives in language, story, cuisine, ritual, and the bones of the land itself? Because if it's the latter, then the Tatars, like so many others across Eurasia, still carry it, not just in blood, but in everything that blood once passed through. What happens when you make movement your whole strategy? You change more than just your location. You shift the balance of possibility itself. In the 13th century, movement was not merely a tool of the Mongol world, it was its foundation. Not symbolic movement, not metaphor, actual movement. Of bodies, of information, of herds, of intentions, and eventually of genes. To understand how mobility became a map-rewriting force in human history, we must return not to the battlefield or the royal tent, but to the hoofbeat. Because what the Mongol Empire demonstrated more clearly than almost any other power before it is that with enough horses the world gets smaller. Before the Mongol expansion, the human map of Eurasia was vast and psychologically fragmented. Great empires rose and fell within their ecological boundaries. The deserts stopped the armies. The mountains slowed the trade. The forests swallowed communication. Geography was a gatekeeper. Culture obeyed terrain. But the Mongol system, emerging from the steppes in the early 13th century, did something startling. It converted flatness into force. It turned vastness into velocity. And at the centre of that shift was the horse. Mongol society, long before it unified under a single banner, was already shaped by equine logic. The pastoral nomads of the steppe didn't just ride horses. They ate from them, lived beside them, slept in tents shaped to match the rhythms of their movement. Children learned to ride as soon as they could walk. Herds numbered in the tens of thousands. The horses were compact, hardy, and remarkably self-sufficient. They could graze under snow, navigate without paths, and tolerate brutal winters. These weren't luxury animals. They were engines, and the engines scaled. A Mongol warrior might ride with multiple remounts, switching horses every few miles to conserve strength. This allowed astonishing distances to be crossed at speeds no infantry-based army could match. Messages, carried through the Yam relay system, could cross thousands of kilometres in a matter of days. Intelligence flowed, supply lines flexed, borders stopped being obstacles and became challenges to outrun. In this ecosystem of motion, conquest was not the anomaly. Stillness was. This matters not just militarily, but biologically. Because once mobility reaches a certain threshold, it starts to have population-level effects. It mixes communities. It weakens the isolation by distance model that has governed much of human genetic divergence. Mobility in the Mongol Empire era wasn't just strategic, it was ecological. Nomadic migrations, merchant caravans, resettlements, forced displacements, and diplomatic circuits. All of them were accelerated by an infrastructure that prioritized the horse. The routes they carved didn't vanish with the empire, they became habits. Even after the Khanates fractured and declined, the networks remained imprinted into Eurasia's connective tissue. Towns that had once been stopovers grew into cities. Marketplaces developed multilingual identities. Populations became mosaics. And the gene flow that began with hooves continued quietly through marriage, adoption, and generations of drift. This is why, when we look at modern Central Eurasian genetic diversity, we see a complexity that cannot be explained by slow diffusion alone. The admixture signals point to pulses, brief but intense episodes where multiple populations collided, commingled, and continued. The 13th century was one of those pulses, and the horse, more than the sword, was its accelerant. But the horse was not merely a carrier, it was a cultural anchor. Mobility didn't dissolve identity, it reshaped it. Steppe cultures retained their distinctiveness even while interacting with distant polities. A Tuvan herder might exchange goods with a Persian trader, adopt elements of Uyghur script, or even serve in a Chinese administrative post, yet still remain deeply embedded in their nomadic cosmology. The horse made this possible. It allowed for contact without permanent relocation, for diplomacy without diaspora, and for a paradoxical kind of stability in motion. To the modern mind, empire is often imagined as walls and capitals, as tax ledgers and stone monuments. But the Mongol Empire challenges that bias. Its greatest legacy may be in the corridors it created. Corridors not of architecture, but of movement. And that movement had consequences. For trade, for memory, for biology. We must be careful not to romanticize this. Mobility was also a vector of violence. The same routes that carried diplomats and merchants also carried epidemics. The same horses that delivered goods also brought armies. And not all who moved did so freely. Enslavement, coercion, and exile were part of the story too. But even in that complexity, the fundamental truth remains. Mobility changed the map. Not the map of borders, but the map of human contact zones. The map of who could meet whom, of who could make children together, of who could leave traces in the chromosomes of the future. And it began with hooves, with small shaggy horses thundering across grasslands, with saddlebags full of arrows, messages, silk or silver, with people who believed that the horizon was not a boundary, but an invitation. So when we ask how the Mongol world left its biological mark, we must look not only at genomes and haplotypes, but at the logic of the saddle. Because sometimes, empire travels not on ambition alone, but on legs that never tire and maps that do not exist on paper. The horse, in that century, was more than transport. It was transformation. And the transformation was permanent. What if the empire changed the world without changing your blood? What if the most lasting legacy of conquest isn't genetic at all? For more than 8 centuries, the Mongol Empire has lived in the imagination of historians, scientists and storytellers alike as a force of staggering transformation. But as we step back from maps and genomes and look at the wider terrain of human history, a quieter question emerges. What precisely does power leave behind, especially when it fades? Does empire survive in people, or in memory, law, and pattern? Empires do not simply end, they dissolve, and in doing so they pass through other things. They become provinces, then regions, then categories, on a tax form or units of land management. Their stories scatter into different textbooks. Their names are borrowed, distorted, reappropriated. Some empires fall with a scream, others vanish like mist, but none disappear completely. And the Mongol Empire, with its extraordinary scale, speed, and cultural entanglement, left its fingerprints far beyond its own collapse. Some of them are biological, but many are not, and in some ways, the biological traces may be the least of it. Think about the map. The imperial borders drawn, erased and redrawn across 13th century Asia shaped not only the territory held by the Mongols, but the political imaginations of their neighbours. The idea that the world could be ruled from horseback, that all peoples might be brought under one vast mobile order, terrified and inspired those who came after. The successor states of the Mongol Empire often justified their own rule in Mongol terms. Russian princes leaned on Mongol traditions of tribute and legitimacy. Chinese dynasties that came after the UN borrowed bureaucratic models and tax strategies forged under Mongol rule. In Persia, administrators used Mongol precedent to negotiate their own role between Islam and imperial pragmatism. The Mongol legacy mutated, refracted through the needs of others, but it was not erased. Or think about institutions. The YAM system, the relay network of way stations and messengers, was arguably the most sophisticated communication infrastructure of its time. It wasn't permanent, but it demonstrated what was possible when a state invested in rapid, continent-spanning logistics. Later systems of courier, post and intelligence across Eurasia learned from or were haunted by that model. Even the very idea that information could travel across such distances within a state's control remained with us. That wasn't a genetic inheritance, that was a logistical one. The legacy also lingers in trade. The Mongol era opened up transcontinental commerce to a degree not seen since the days of Roman and Han contact. The Silk Road under the Pax Mongolica became a conduit not just for luxury goods, but for ideas, foods, texts, and people. After the empire fractured, those trade corridors remained. The institutional memory of a movement persisted. You can still trace its shape in trade patterns that lasted centuries beyond the fall of Mongol political unity. The idea that there could be a centre to the world, a Central Asia from which commerce, ideas and empires radiated, has its roots in part in this era. Then there is fear. The Mongol invasions reshaped the trauma maps of multiple civilizations. In Europe, chronicles of the invaders from the east filled libraries for generations. In the Islamic world, memories of Mongol sackings became theological as well as historical crises. In parts of China, the stories of foreign rule sharpened cultural and ethnic identities. What survives here isn't a sequence of alleles. It's a pattern of warning, of how history gets narrated to children, of what gets burned into cultural reflex. Whole architectures of paranoia, unity and strategy have roots in how the Mongols were remembered. Even our science is not untouched. From the earliest European attempts to classify race and civilization to more modern efforts to map human movement, the Mongol Empire has been a recurring model of both exception and precedent. Was it a fluke? A hyper-efficient military engine with no comparison? Or was it a case study in how mobility and adaptability outperform size or tradition? Scientific theories about migration, empire, and even epidemiology have used the Mongols as examples, metaphors, and case studies. The empire shows up where you least expect it, in footnotes and models, in debates about what makes a society resilient. Myth is part of this legacy too. The figure of Genghis Khan has undergone so many revisions, across so many cultures, that it's hard to say who or what he symbolises anymore. To some, he is a national hero. To others, a war criminal. To yet others, a blank slate onto which genetic hopes and fears are projected. This mythological churn is not evidence of a man's character, but of an empire's gravitational pull. What kind of empire generates both statues and nightmares 800 years later? That's not about DNA, that's about cultural mass. And then there is the question of what doesn't survive. Mongolian script was never widely adopted beyond certain regions. The Mongol language itself splintered. Even the administrative systems that had once seemed like permanent innovations eventually gave way to other models. This too is a legacy, not of endurance, but of disappearance. The fact that you can build the largest contiguous empire in human history and still be remembered more for your horse than your institutions says something sobering about impermanence. Empire, even on that scale, does not guarantee lasting influence. What sticks is what others absorb, adapt, or refuse to forget. So what does power really leave behind? Maybe not what it intends. Maybe not what we measure. In the case of the Mongol Empire, it's not a simple through line of inheritance, but a series of after-images. Some faded, some vivid, all refracted through the needs of the present. And maybe that's the true legacy of empire, less a lineage than a lens. a way of seeing the world through what once was possible, terrible, or beautiful. And maybe that's what power always is. Not a bloodline, not a dynasty, but a shadow. The things people continue to say, believe, fear, or build, long after the banners have fallen, long after the blood has stopped speaking, long after the last name has been forgotten. And maybe that's how the Empire changed us after all. Not in our bones, but in our stories. Why are we so eager to be descended from a Khan? Why does a distant Y chromosome haplotype passed down through centuries of silent inheritance make some of us feel larger, more meaningful, as if the weight of history might be wrapped up in our blood? The strange thing is, we know better. We know that our genes are not prophecies. They do not whisper old truths. They do not care about conquest, or memory, or pride. And yet, the moment a scientific paper suggests that 1 in 200 men may carry a fragment of Genghis Khan's lineage, something stirs. The headlines multiply. The YouTube videos appear. The storytelling machinery of the modern world activates. Not because we truly believe we are heirs to empire, but because we want to. It's a very old instinct, to want our ancestors to be kings, to want the past to justify the present. But in the genomic age, this impulse wears a new mask. It calls itself evidence. It calls itself analysis. You spit in a tube, you click a button, and what returns to you is not just percentages or populations. What returns is a story, and more often than not, a flattering one. It tells you that you are a little bit Viking, that your maternal line traces back to a warrior queen, that your haplogroup might have moved with the steppes, or that you perhaps carry the ghost of a Khan in your veins. This isn't a scientific question anymore. It's a psychological one. Why does ancestry captivate us so deeply in an era when most of us know, rationally, that descent is a statistical accident, that DNA does not contain character, that genetics is a map of probabilities, not proof of meaning? The answer, if there is one, may begin in uncertainty. In the modern world, we move more than any humans in history. We migrate, we urbanize, we leave our childhood dialects behind, our foods, our rituals. The family stories we used to hear at dinner fade into silence, and somewhere in that drift, a quiet hunger grows, not for nationalism exactly, not for identity in the political sense, but for connection. A line, a shape that says, you came from somewhere. Something that can be named, labelled, held. DNA testing promises to give us that shape, quickly, cleanly, and with bar graphs. But bar graphs aren't myths. And humans, for all our rationality, are still storytelling creatures. We do not want to be told our great-great-grandfather was a wheat farmer in the Don River Basin and leave it at that. We want someone legendary, someone who mattered, someone whose blood was not just passed on but meant something. This is where the myth of Genghis Khan's descendants gets its grip, because it offers that rarest of psychological illusions, a link between ordinary life and historical magnitude. It says you, the person on a couch in a studio apartment, might be biologically related to the man who reshaped the world, that your existence is not random, but part of an imperial arc. It is a myth of significance, and like most good myths, it survives not by accuracy, but by emotional utility. The truth is simpler and quieter. Most of us are descended from everyone. In a world of overlapping lineages, tangled ancestries, and hundreds of generations of recombination, the idea of being uniquely descended from anyone is mathematically meaningless beyond a few centuries. Genghis Khan may well be your ancestor, but so are thousands of peasants. So are slaves. So are forgotten women whose names were never recorded. The genome remembers them equally. And in many ways, that should be more moving. But it doesn't sell. It doesn't headline. So we turn instead to stories of dominance, of conquerors whose legacy, we're told, lives in our blood. We click. We share. We imagine the past as a family tree with a few thick trunks. But the tree isn't real. What's real is the forest, tangled, indistinct, and far older than any surname or title. Ancestry myths are not inherently harmful. They can offer comfort. They can connect people to history in ways that open doors rather than close them. But when those myths become obsession, or worse, entitlement, they lead us down strange roads. We begin to divide the world not by who we are, but by who we think we were. We mistake inheritance for merit. We turn statistics into stories. And we forget that our most important ancestors are not the ones with crowns, but the ones who survived. And so, the myth of the Khan endures, not because the science proves it, but because we want it to be true. We want to believe that some part of us is tied to power, to glory, to a man whose name shaped continents. But maybe the better story is this, that power fades, but people endure. That you do not need a famous ancestor to matter. That every human carries a billion-year story in their cells, whether or not it includes a Khan, and that maybe, just maybe, it's time we learn to be proud of that. What does it mean to change the genetic future of a continent without leaving behind a single clear signature? This is the contradiction at the heart of the Mongol legacy. An empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Black Sea, that reshaped trade, law, religion and borders. And yet when we go looking for the biological imprint of its founder, we find only fog, no tomb, no bones, no unbroken lineage. And maybe, just maybe, that's the wrong place to be looking. Because genetic legacy doesn't always come from father to son. Sometimes it comes from movement, from chaos, from millions of bodies in motion, through war, through exile, through trade, through coercion, through survival. The Mongol Empire did not leave behind a population of miniature Khans, but it did leave behind something harder to trace, and perhaps more profound. A tangled web of shared fragments, drifting through time, carried not by dynasties, but by accident. By the close of the 13th century, no part of the Mongol world was untouched by this human rearrangement. It was not a process of replacement, it was a mixture, the mixing of gene pools that had once been separated by deserts, by mountain chains, by language and suspicion. Suddenly, under the enforced peace of Mongol rule, barriers collapsed. Populations moved, some willingly, some not, and in their wake came the slow, invisible storm of inheritance. This is not mythology, it's math. The statistical accumulation of shared fragments, tiny segments of DNA, recombined across generations that slowly disperse but never quite vanish. These are not the heroic stories of empire. They're the mundane aftermaths. The marriage brokered for diplomacy, the orphan adopted into a new village, the caravan labourer who stayed behind in a foreign outpost and started a family. This is the genetic residue of empires, not bold, not glorious, but stubborn, quiet, everywhere. And yet, for all the modern power of genetic analysis, it's hard to turn this truth into a story. The data do not say, this was Genghis Khan's blood. They say, people moved, people mixed, and some of those movements may have been shaped, facilitated, or forced by the existence of the Mongol Empire. That's a subtler narrative. It does not offer the clarity of lineage, but it does offer something else, an understanding of history as process rather than legend, as entropy rather than myth. So in the end, the Empire really did change our genes, just not the way we thought. Not through a single man's astonishing reproductive success, not through a golden family tree that spans the continent, but through roads, through policy, through conquest and infrastructure and administrative compulsion. The biological legacy of the Mongols is not a marker, it's a smear. And in that smear across Central Asia and beyond, you can still feel the wake of something vast. We went looking for a patriarch. What we found was something messier, and perhaps more honest. Because legacy isn't about whose name survives. It's about whose world you live in, long after they're gone. And for a few strange centuries, that world, our world, was carved by horsemen, whose bones we cannot find, but whose consequences we still inherit. Not in legend, not in titles, but in the shifting blood of strangers. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down, and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, then you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine?